Hello. First time here? Welcome. If you're back for more, it's great to have you. Where are you watching from and what time is it? Drop a comment below. Now sit back and relax. Back in the late 70s, I was a little girl around 7 or 8 years old. I loved spending time on my uncle's farm because it provided some stability in my life. My mom, as my grandma used to say, couldn't sit still. We moved constantly 12 times in just 1 year alone. My uncle worked full-time and ran the farm, so whenever drifters passed through, he'd offer them a place to stay and a hot meal, courtesy of my aunt, in exchange for an extra hand around the farm. One Saturday evening, after a long day of work, my uncle took one of these farmhands out to dinner at the local restaurant, which also served as the bar, gas station, and market. The tiny village only had one other building, the church. My uncle came home later that evening, but not with his farmhand. We'll call him Tom from here on out. My uncle explained that Tom had decided to stay behind at the bar to hang out with the other patrons. That night, my cousin Rick came home and decided to sleep on the couch in the living room, not wanting to risk waking my aunt and uncle by sneaking into his bedroom. Rick was about 15 or 16 at the time, and he had come home way past his curfew. He had only been lying down for about 30 minutes when the front door opened. It was Tom, and he was covered in blood. Rick knew that Tom worked on the farm and could have been butchering an animal, but he couldn't figure out why he'd be doing that so late at night. All he knew was that something told him to keep his eyes shut and pretend to be asleep, so he did. Tom stood there for what felt like an unusually long time, just staring at him, before finally walking away. Rick then heard the washing machine start up, followed by the sound of the shower turning on. He thought the whole situation was odd, but eventually managed to fall asleep. The next day began like any other until my aunt came home from church. She had to break the terrible news to my uncle that his lifelong friends, the couple who owned the local restaurant, bar, and market, had been brutally hacked to death the previous night with an axe. They lived in the house attached to their business. When Rick heard the news, he recalled Tom's strange behavior the night before, covered in blood. He pulled my aunt aside to tell her what he had seen and to ask if Tom had been working late. Of course, the answer was no. She immediately called the sheriff's office, and they arrived quickly. Thankfully, some blood had been left on the washing machine, and even though DNA evidence wasn't what it is today, they were able to trace it back to one of the victims. What truly chills me to the core is that it came out in court that Tom had told the sheriff that when he returned to my uncle's home that night, if anyone had been awake, he was going to kill them all, and he now wishes he had. The scariest part is that I was sleeping on the couch opposite my cousin that night. Afterward, my mom never let me spend the night there again. During Thanksgiving weekend of 2016, like many families across the United States, the Guy family from Knoxville, Tennessee gathered together to celebrate the holiday, spend quality time, and give thanks for their blessings. 61-year-old Joel Michael Guy Sr. worked as a pipeline engineer, while his 55-year-old wife, Lisa, held a position as a human resources administrator in Oak Ridge. Their 28-year-old son, Joel Jr., had attended Hanville High School before graduating from the Louisiana School for Math, Science, and the Arts in 2006. Despite his academic achievements, Joel Jr. had never been able to hold a steady job. Instead, he drifted from college to college, uncertain about his future and holding vague dreams of becoming a plastic surgeon. In the fall of 2016, the Guys had recently sold their Knoxville home, planning to retire to the nearby town of Sirgonesville. Thanksgiving weekend would be the final time the family would gather in their Golden View Lane home, and it was meant to be a sentimental occasion. But instead of a happy celebration, it would become unforgettable for entirely different, tragic reasons. On Saturday, November 26th, with the Thanksgiving leftovers slowly running out, Lisa went to the local Walmart to pick up groceries. Joel Sr. was upstairs in a room they used for exercise, equipped with a Bowflex, elliptical, and free weights. It's likely he was up there trying to work off the indulgence of extra turkey and pie. But things were about to take a dark turn for the Guy family. Suddenly, The door to the exercise room swung open, and standing there was Joel Jr., his face filled with an intense, terrifying expression. In his hand, he held a knife. One can only imagine the shock and fear Joel Sr. must have felt as his son lunged at him, stabbing wildly and plunging the knife in and out of his chest. While we can never know for sure what Joel Sr.'s last words were, a reasonable guess would be why. After his father was dead, Joel Jr. removed the clothes from his father's lifeless body and piled them nearby. Once he finished, he calmly walked downstairs, sat in the TV room, and waited for his mother to return. Lisa arrived home about an hour later, unaware of the horror that had just unfolded upstairs. She called out for both Joel and her husband, but neither responded. Joel Jr. was no longer in the TV room, and there was no sound from upstairs. Both of their cars were still parked outside, leading her to believe they must have left the house for some reason. Confused but not alarmed, Lisa began to make her way upstairs, thinking her husband might still be working out. Little did she know, this would be her last act. As she reached the top of the stairs, Joel Jr. lunged at her, stabbing her so deeply in the ribcage that several of her bones were severed. He continued to stab her until she finally collapsed onto the carpet, blood pooling from the multiple wounds. As with his father, Joel Jr. stripped his mother's body of her clothes, and it was then that he placed her next to his father's body in the exercise room. What followed was a grotesque mutilation of his parents' bodies. Taking one of the knives, Joel Jr. severed his father's hands at the wrists, tossing them into the pile of torn clothing. He then attempted to decapitate his mother, but according to the coroner's report, he did so in an especially gruesome manner. You see, the knives that Joel Jr. was using were fantastic at cutting through flesh, but not so great at cutting through thick bone. As a result, it appears that Joel sliced through a huge section of his mother's neck and then proceeded to tear it from its moorings with force. Jolton picked the severed head up, took it downstairs into the kitchen, and began to boil it in a large pot of water. Jolton walked back upstairs to continue the dismemberment. He cut off his parents' limbs, then placed each of their disarticulated body parts into a series of large chemical drums that he'd filled with industrial-strength cleaning chemicals. Yet before he did this, he made sure to partially disembowel each of his parents, which would allow the corrosive chemicals into their abdominal cavities and aid in the rate of decomposition. It's at this point that we realized that this was no spur-of-the-moment crime of passion. Joel Jr. had obviously been reading a great deal about how to quickly and effectively dispose of dead bodies, and given he'd gathered materials to do so, he'd obviously been planning to kill his parents for quite some time. Yet, as much as Joel had taken the time to research his bloody endeavor, he would come to make a grave singular error. During the attack on his father, Joel Jr.'s hand had slipped on the blade, resulting in a deep cut to his left thumb. At around 3:30 p.m. on the day of the murder, Joel was spotted in the first aid section of the nearby Walmart, buying a variety of medical supplies as well as some isopropyl alcohol and hydrogen peroxide, which he presumably planned to use to hide the evidence of his crimes. The following day, Joel Jr. went back to his home in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, visiting a student medical clinic there to have the wound to his thumb examined. Both trips would ultimately be used against Joel in a court of law. And it seems that no matter how much planning and research he'd done, his was far from the perfect murder. A few days after she was killed, Lisa Guy failed to show up to her shift at Jacobs Engineering. Her supervisor recognized this as extremely out of character, and when she was unable to contact her at home, called 911 report Lisa is missing. Long after the 911 call was made, Knox County officers Stephen Ballard and Jeremy McCord pulled up outside 11434 Golden View Lane. The home appeared to be deserted, and there was even a sold sign on the front lawn, but officers noted that there was no real estate lock on the front door. With the officers' curiosity piqued, they walked around to the rear of the home to discover that the back door's handle had been removed, and appeared that someone then attached it to the front door's handle, possibly in an attempt to render both impassable. The officers then attempted to peer through a window at the front of the house and discovered something strange. The glass, which should have been chilly to the touch, was actually warm. Everyone likes to be cozy during cold winters, but it was so hot and humid in the Guy family home that if anyone was still inside, they'd be horribly uncomfortable. Some of you might be able to guess why Joel Jr. might have cranked up the thermostat before fleeing to Louisiana. But for those of you that can't, part of his research had told Joel that turning up the home's central heating would aid in the decomposition of his parents' dead bodies. And needless to say, when one of the officers began to detect a very distinct odor coming from inside of the house, he knew something foul had occurred. The first thing the officers saw upon gaining entry to the home were money, a sledgehammer, and some firearms laid out on the table. It was only after entering the kitchen that they realized that something was gently simmering on the stove. And upon approaching it, they discovered Lisa Guy's head bloated and swollen from having spent 2 days in the huge pot. They then discovered Joel Guy Sr.'s dismembered hands on the floor by looking down a hallway with a further search revealing the corpse-filled chemical drums in an upstairs bathroom. Investigators also found sewer line cleaner, a bag of baking soda, liquid fire brand drain cleaner, acid, drain opener, lye, food-grade hydrogen peroxide, bleach, and a bleach sprayer, all of which made up the cocktail of chemicals which now ate away at the couple's remains. Investigators also discovered a note in an open suitcase that depicted the name and Louisiana address of an Ace Hardware store, along with the notation about sewer line cleaner. The toxic fluid required biohazard equipment for removal by the KCSO hazmat team. And due to the volume of evidence in such a disturbing discovery, KCSO's forensic unit worked throughout the night Monday and into the following day processing the crime scene. Some said it was the most horrifying crime scene they'd ever come across. And as you can imagine, the discovery generated a huge amount of media attention. Naturally, local law enforcement sought to close the case as quickly as possible. But as forensic investigators combed through the crime scene, they came to a harrowing conclusion. The killer was most likely the couple's own son. Over the days that followed, the FBI, the Knox County Sheriff's Office, and the East Baton Rouge Sheriff's Office placed Guy Jr. under surveillance. They also sought to build a picture of Joel Jr.'s actions in the days leading up to the murder. And what they discovered horrified them. Through analyzing the security camera footage from several local stores, the police were able to identify Joel Jr. as purchasing the very supplies he would use to murder and dispose of his parents. He used cash for every transaction and stuck to self-checkouts to avoid any memorable interactions with staff members. The earliest Joel began to purchase these supplies was November 7th, proving premeditation by at least 2 weeks. Sometime later, Joel bought a U.S. Marine-style K-bar knife from a business known as Academy Sports, the very same knife he would later use to stab his fathers to death. Then, on November 21st, just a few days before the murders, he can be seen in a Knoxville Walmart buying a plastic blue tote large enough for the dismembered bodies to dissolve in. But perhaps the most disturbing piece of evidence was the notebook police found in Joel Jr.'s possessions after he was arrested at his Baton Rouge apartment on November 29th. Not only did Joel have a meat grinder in the trunk of his car, he also had a journal in which he'd written down numerous notes pertaining to the murder. Some of them read as follows: "Get carving knives, killing knives, quiet, multiple. Get sledgehammer, crush bones. Bring blender and food grinder, grind meat to make small pieces. Get bleach, denature proteins, get plastic sheeting for disposal process. Get plastic bin for denaturation process. Get hollow point bullets just in case." Joel then seems to correct himself and writes, "Will be seen buying bullets. Just use computer room gun. Check to make sure there are bullets. Last resort." The location of the killings didn't matter. The main priority was to erase any traces that could link him to the crime. He knew that getting rid of the bloody spots would be critical in preventing any determination of the time of death. The mattress and couches didn't need to be touched, but the bodies, as long as there was no forensic evidence on them, were to be removed. If they couldn't be hidden, the parts of the bodies would be disposed of carefully. Chunks flushed down the toilet, not down the garbage disposal. The doggy door would provide a convenient way for an intruder to enter and set up a random, external suspect. Flooding the house would cover any forensic evidence, and turning the heater up high would accelerate decomposition. Dousing the area with bleach would further complicate the investigation since bleach reacts with luminol just like blood does. The time of death could potentially be a problem, but he knew that confusing it would make it easier to set up his alibi. His father was dead, which meant there would be no one left to claim his mother's share of the life insurance. That left the entire $500,000 to him. Joel had handed over all the evidence needed for his conviction. His writings revealed the depths of his greed and malicious intent. A son willing to kill his own parents for money rather than simply getting a job. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Joel Jr. pleaded not guilty to capital murder. He also filed a motion, through his attorney, requesting that if convicted, he be immediately sentenced to death. Oddly enough, Joel also refused to allow his defense attorneys to suppress evidence on his behalf. As a result, the trial lasted only 4 days, which is extremely unusual for a multiple murder case. Although Joel hoped for the death penalty, the judge denied his request and instead chose a different punishment. The judge informed him that the true sentence would be the guilt he'd have to live with for the rest of his life, knowing he had taken the lives of the very people who brought him into the world. When I was a teenager, I got invited to one of the wildest house parties I'd ever been to. It was a blast while it lasted, but the reason I remember it is far from positive, as you'll see. Like I said, this party was out of control. There were kegs in every downstairs room, people stripping down and dancing in the backyard, and a group upstairs actually tore down a bedroom wall with a sledgehammer. It was absolute chaos. With a party that crazy, it wasn't surprising that the bathroom was filled with puke and there were random people passed out all over the place. But the one guy I noticed was lying on the couch in the downstairs TV room. He'd clearly overdone it because, by the time I got there, he was out cold, just sprawled on the couch like he'd claimed it as his own. People just stepped over him, danced around him, and drank beside him without bothering him all night long. At the end of the night, I was too drunk to even think about calling an Uber, so I decided to crash in one of the upstairs bedrooms and figure out how to get home in the morning. I had a terrible, hungover sleep and woke up to gather my things. When I was heading downstairs to leave, I passed by the guy who had been passed out on the couch the night before. He hadn't moved at all, and that didn't sit right with me. So I tried to wake him up. Ever touch someone and realize they're dead? Their body goes so cold and stiff, and it's honestly one of the worst feelings you could ever have. I immediately let out a yelp when I felt how cold he was, and that got a few people from the party, still half asleep, wandering into the TV room to see what was going on. I just kept begging them to call 911 because there was a dead guy on the couch. It freaked everyone out, mostly because, like I said, we'd been partying, dancing, and drinking around him all night, probably unaware that he had already passed away. He was still lying in the same position as when he passed out. We had no way of knowing when he had actually died or how long we'd been partying around a corpse. I heard it was an overdose, but that was never confirmed. I barely knew anyone at the party, only that they seemed like decent people, and it was a real tragedy how one of them went out. Since then, I've been super cautious about drugs and alcohol, and I make sure to tell my kids to always be safe if they decide to drink or smoke or whatever else. I know I can't stop them from misbehaving, especially at their age, and it's not even the substances I worry about. I just never want them to have to know what it feels like to touch cold, lifeless flesh, or look at someone's face and know they're gone. I don't ever want them to experience death like I did. Have you ever seen something so out of place that your brain tries to make sense of it in the most logical way possible? Like when you're driving late at night and spot something in the sky, and your first instinct is to convince yourself it's just a plane or maybe a far-off tower. That's how it all began for me. It was just a typical late-night drive home, nothing out of the ordinary, until I saw the lights hovering above the field. It was around 11 p.m., and I was driving back from a weekend trip with my girlfriend, Jess. We were on one of those long stretches of highway where the road seems to vanish into the darkness and there's not another car in sight. Just us, the road, and the stars. I remember the first time I saw the lights. They appeared faint, barely noticeable, hovering over a field to our right. At first, I thought it was a distant airplane or maybe some reflection from the ground. Jess hadn't noticed yet, so I didn't mention it. We'd been driving for hours, and I chalked it up to tired eyes. But as we drove on, the lights grew brighter. They weren't blinking like plain lights, and they didn't move in the usual way. Instead of crossing the sky like an aircraft would, they stayed still, hovering, before suddenly shifting positions in a way that didn't make sense. "Hey, do you see that?" I asked Jess, trying to sound casual, even though my stomach was already doing flips. She looked up from her phone, squinting out the passenger window. "See what? Those lights?" I said, nodding toward the field. "Right there." She leaned forward, frowning. "What the hell is that?" I was relieved that she saw them too. At least I wasn't imagining it. The lights were much brighter now, 3 or 4 of them hovering in a tight group, almost as if they were watching something. "Maybe it's some kind of drone," Jess suggested, though her voice was less sure than usual. I didn't answer. I was too focused on the lights as they suddenly split apart, each moving in a different direction before freezing again, completely still. There was something unsettling about how they moved, too fast, too smooth, unlike anything I had ever seen before. Without thinking, I pressed harder on the gas, wanting to put more distance between us and whatever was out there. Jess turned to me, her eyes wide with concern. "What do you think it is?" "I don't know," I said, "but it's weird, right?" She nodded, biting her lip as she glanced back at the lights. "Yeah, really weird." We drove in silence for a few more minutes, both of us occasionally looking at the lights. They didn't seem to be getting any closer, but they weren't fading away either. It was like they were keeping pace with us, staying just out of reach but close enough to make their presence known. That's when the engine sputtered. I frowned, glancing at the dashboard. The lights flickered, the radio cut out for a second, and the car jerked, as if something had momentarily drained the power. My heart skipped a beat, and I eased off the gas, hoping it was just a fluke. But then it happened again. The car stuttered, the headlights dimmed, and the engine made a low, strained sound, like it was struggling to keep going. "What's happening?" Jess asked, her voice rising in panic. "I don't know," I muttered, my grip tightening on the wheel. I slowed the car to a crawl, scanning the road for a safe place to pull over. We were in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by empty fields, with no buildings or street lights in sight. The car lurched one final time before the engine cut out completely. We coasted to a stop on the side of the road. The only sound, the faint rustle of the wind through the fields. Jess and I sat there in stunned silence for a moment, both of us staring at the dashboard as if willing the car to start up again. But the engine was dead, and the headlights had dimmed to a soft glow before fading out entirely. "This can't be happening," Jess whispered, her hands shaking as she fumbled for her phone. She held it up, but her face dropped when she saw the screen. No signal. I checked my phone too, but it was the same. No bars, no way to call for help. My stomach twisted with unease, and I turned my attention back to the field. The lights were still there, hovering above the field like they were watching us. And now, without the car's engine humming or the radio playing, the silence around us felt oppressive. I unbuckled my seatbelt and opened the door, stepping out into the cool night air. Jess shot me a panicked look. "What are you doing?" "I'm gonna check the engine," I said, though part of me wasn't sure if I even wanted to. I popped the hood and leaned in, shining the flashlight from my phone over the engine. Everything looked fine. No smoke, no signs of overheating. But that didn't explain why the car had just died on us. Suddenly, Jess gasped from inside the car. "Oh my God, they're getting closer." I straightened up and turned toward the field. Sure enough, the lights were moving. Slowly, but unmistakably, they were drifting toward us, their glow brighter and more intense than before. My heart pounded in my chest as I slammed the hood shut and hurried back to the driver's side. "Get in," Jess urged, her voice shaking. I climbed back into the car, locking the doors behind me, though I wasn't sure what good that would do. The lights were still advancing, closing the distance between us and the field. They weren't moving erratically anymore. Now they were coming straight for us. "What do we do?" Jess whispered, her eyes locked on the lights. I didn't have an answer. I tried turning the key in the ignition again, but the engine didn't make a sound. We were stuck. The lights drew closer, now so near that I could see them flickering and pulsing, casting long, eerie shadows across the field. The air around us felt heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't explain, like the static right before a storm. Then, just as quickly as they'd appeared, the lights stopped. They hovered, maybe 50 yards from the car, glowing in unsettling silence. Jess and I stared, frozen, waiting for something to happen. But for what felt like an eternity, nothing did. Then, slowly, one by one, the lights began to rise, higher and higher, until they were just faint pinpricks of light in the dark sky, blending in with the stars. My heart was still pounding as I sat there, watching the lights vanish into the night. The weight in the air seemed to lift, and just like that, the car's dashboard flickered back to life. The headlights blinked on, and the engine rumbled to life, as if nothing had ever been wrong. Jess and I exchanged a look, both of us too stunned to speak. "Drive," she whispered. "Please, just drive." I didn't need to be told twice. I slammed the car into gear, gravel spraying as we sped down the road. We didn't stop until we reached the next town, where we pulled into a gas station and sat in silence for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Neither of us could explain the lights. I wanted to believe it was some strange atmospheric phenomenon, maybe a trick of the light or a drone malfunction. But deep down, I knew it was something far beyond that, something I couldn't understand. To this day, I still don't know what we saw that night, but every time I drive that stretch of road now, I can't help but glance toward the fields, half expecting to see those strange lights again. And every time I do, I remember how they moved, how they seemed to follow us, and how they watched. My boyfriend and I had recently purchased a house together. It's a charming two-story place with an attic, a basement, and a double garage, and we got an incredible deal on it. However, there's one catch: we didn't have a seller's agreement. The previous owner, who likely inherited the property, never even set foot inside. To give you some context, we were in a tough spot at the time. We had just been evicted from our apartment, and we were also looking after some foster pets, which made our options for rental homes even slimmer. A lot of places around here don't allow pets. Now, before I dive into the main part of the story, let me tell you a little more about us. I'm a 20-year-old woman, and my boyfriend is a 30-year-old man. I've always been a skeptic when it comes to things like this, but that doesn't mean I haven't had experiences that make me question what I believe. But those are stories for another time. What I'm about to share is something I always thought was just an old wives' tale, but after everything that's happened, I'm not so sure anymore. So my boyfriend, let's call him P, and I moved in with one of my close friends and her boyfriend. They rent a room from us, which really helps with the mortgage. My friend, M, is 3 years younger than me, and her boyfriend, E, is 4 years younger. E and I set up a man cave in the basement. We spend our evenings gaming, drinking, and basically getting some space from our partners. Meanwhile, P and M turned the attic into a more refined space for writing and tinkering with old typewriters. We've been living in the house for a couple of months now, adjusting to its quirks. Its creaks and pops, the usual things you'd expect from an older home. The neighbors on the other side have mice in their attic, and sometimes you can hear them scurrying around above us. But during this time, I've noticed a few odd things that just don't sit right with me. For example, the upstairs bathroom makes a strange gurgling noise, but only I've ever heard it. When I asked P, M, and E about it, none of them had heard it themselves. It was bizarre, but I didn't think too much of it. There's another bathroom downstairs, almost directly beneath the one upstairs, just past the kitchen. My cat follows me everywhere. He's always squeaking for attention, wanting me to hold him, but for some reason, he won't follow me into that bathroom unless I really coax him. He'll just sit at the door, squeaking manically, until I encourage him to come in with me. And when he does, he'll suddenly fixate on a specific spot in the hallway, not breaking eye contact, and then he'll dart back to me, keeping low to the ground. I know this behavior usually signals fear, but there's no apparent reason for it, and I can't make sense of it. To make it even stranger, He's recently started going into the bathroom on his own and just howling at the wall. It's weird, but well, cats, right? P and I have our setup in the basement, and I have to admit, it gives me the creeps. I used to avoid spending much time down there until I decided to cover the walls with a large sheet of fabric that looks like vertical striped wallpaper. When I did that, I made sure to cover a doorway that leads to a small room under the front porch. There's something about that room that just unsettles me. It feels like it's watching you. It's hard to describe, but every time I get that eerie feeling, it's always from that same room. The room doesn't even have a door, and even though I've covered the doorway, I still sometimes feel that same presence. My cat avoids it too, but last week, Pete told me about something strange that happened while we were sitting together. We'd been gaming, and between matches, we took a break to vent about our bad teammates. Just the usual MOBA player frustrations. Anyway, Pete told me that during our conversation, he hallucinated seeing his girlfriend, walk downstairs and into the basement with us. But when he turned to talk to her, she was gone. I laughed it off, thinking maybe he'd been smoking too much or was just disoriented. But earlier tonight, I had an unsettling experience of my own in the basement. I was alone when I heard the basement door open, and I saw someone walk down the stairs. I thought, heading towards the chair or maybe a cigarette. But when I turned to speak to her, there was no one there. I quickly checked behind me, but the room was empty. I searched the entire basement and even called for her, but she was nowhere to be found. It wasn't until I realized she wasn't there that my cat suddenly howled and bolted up the stairs. I sat there in confusion for a few moments, then told my friends I was stepping away from the game for a bit. I felt strangely lost. I decided to text Em from the basement, and sure enough, she hadn't come downstairs at all. She'd been in her workspace for hours, which meant that while I was seeing her in the basement, she was 2 stories above me the whole time. So what did I actually see? Or more importantly, who did I just see? At 18, it was the start of summer, and I had a few days off from school with no job to worry about. Most of my time was spent indoors, either playing video games, watching shows on Netflix, or just relaxing. On this particular occasion, my parents had gone out of town for a few days, leaving me alone in the house. This was something that happened often, and it never really bothered me. I'd occasionally invite friends over, but this night, I was just enjoying some alone time. I was watching a rerun of one of my favorite shows on Netflix, multitasking by scrolling through my phone. It was late, probably around 11 or 12, and that's when I heard a knock at the front door. I paused the TV and went to see who it was. It didn't immediately register how late it was, but thankfully, I realized before I made the mistake of opening the door carelessly. Looking through the peephole, I saw 2 men standing outside, both dressed similarly, waiting for me to answer. I paused for a second, debating whether or not to call out and ask what they wanted. Ultimately, I stayed silent, just observing them, hoping they would leave. But a few moments later, they called out, "Hello, we're here to speak with Mr. and Mrs. Ian." That was my parents' name, though I've changed it for privacy reasons. I felt confused but remained quiet, knowing it was far too late for any kind of visit, even if it was urgent. After a minute or so, the 2 men exchanged a few words quietly and then walked off the porch. The outdoor lights were off, so I couldn't see where they went, but I didn't hear any cars or headlights, which made me wonder if they had walked there. That only made the situation feel even more strange. I returned to the TV, leaving it paused for a bit just in case they came back. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps again, this time coming up to the porch. But instead of knocking, they walked around to the side of the house. I hurried to the back window just in time to see them enter the backyard. They opened the gate and stepped inside. I quickly moved away from the window to avoid being seen, but I could hear them approaching the back door. They started talking quietly before trying to mess with the door. I took this as my chance to get my phone and hide inside the garage. I called the police, explaining the possible break-in that was taking place. And after less than a minute, a loud pop sound vibrated through the house and the back door slid open. Their footsteps went through the house and straight to the stairs going up to the bedrooms. A door opened, they entered, then closed it behind them. But after that, there were no more sounds. I waited for a horrifying and slow 10 minutes in silence before the police pulled up to the house. When they did, there was a few quick footsteps upstairs. Then the two men started arguing. A few officers came in through the back door and ran upstairs, while another came to the garage and helped me outside. The men didn't resist the rest, but they also didn't speak a word on why they were there. Despite weeks going by and it being somewhat obvious that they weren't simply robbing the house, the only thing they could charge them with was breaking and entering. It scares me, though, that they seemed to be looking for my parents, and it almost felt like they were going to wait upstairs for them until they came back from their trip. I think back to whether or not I should have shown myself and if that would have stopped the break-in. But something about their behavior tells me that they still would have broken in and would have done to me whatever was necessary. The moment I stumbled upon that clearing in the woods, I knew I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to. What I didn't realize was that the next 24 hours would test every ounce of strength and will I had left, pushing me to fight for my life. My name's Sarah, and I'm an avid hiker. There's nothing I love more than losing myself in nature, hearing the crunch of leaves under my boots, and breathing in the crisp air of the forest. That's why I decided to take a solo hiking trip in the Cascade Mountains. Just me, my backpack, and miles of unspoiled wilderness. I'd been on the trail for 3 days, reveling in the solitude and the breathtaking views. On the 4th morning, I woke up early, eager to cover some ground before the heat of the day set in. The trail I'd chosen was less traveled, winding through dense forest and rocky outcroppings. It was challenging, but that's how I liked it. As the sun climbed higher, I decided to take a short detour off the main path. There was a small stream marked on my map that looked like the perfect spot for a lunch break. I pushed through thick underbrush, the sound of running water growing louder. That's when I saw it. The clearing was man-made. That much was obvious. Tarps were strung up between trees, creating makeshift shelters. But it was what lay beneath those tarps that made my blood run cold. Crates, dozens of them. And beside those crates, weapons. The kind you don't see outside of war zones. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Gun runners, drug smugglers, whatever it was, I knew I had stumbled onto something dangerous. I took a step back, ready to get the hell out of there when a twig snapped under my foot. The sound seemed to echo through the clearing. "Hey, who's there?" A gruff voice shattered the silence. My heart leaped into my throat as I saw a man emerge from one of the shelters, a rifle in his hands. I didn't think. I ran. Crashing through the underbrush, I could hear shouts behind me. They were coming. The peaceful forest that had been my sanctuary was now a deadly trap. And I was the prey. I ran harder than I ever had in my life. Branches whipped at my face. Roots threatened to trip me with every step. But I didn't dare slow down. The sounds of pursuit were getting closer. There. I see her. A bullet whizzed past my ear, splintering the bark of a tree just inches from my head. They were shooting at me. This was real. This was happening. I veered off to the left, hoping to lose them in a particularly dense patch of forest. My lungs were burning, my legs screaming for rest, but stopping wasn't an option. As I ran, my mind raced almost as fast as my feet. I needed a plan. I couldn't outrun them forever. I needed to outsmart them. The ground began to slope upward, and I remembered seeing a series of cliffs on my map. If I could reach higher ground, maybe I could find a place to hide, to catch my breath and think. I scrambled up the incline using roots and rocks as handholds. The shouts behind me were growing fainter, but I didn't dare hope I'd lost them. These men knew these woods probably better than I did. Finally, I reached a small plateau. Gasping for air, I looked around frantically for somewhere to hide. That's when I saw it. A narrow crevice in the rock face, just big enough for a person to squeeze through. Without hesitation, I shimmied into the gap. It was a tight fit, the rough stones scraping against my skin, but I pushed on. The crevice opened up into a small cave, damp and dark but blessedly hidden. I slumped against the cool rock, trying to quiet my ragged breathing. Outside, I could hear my pursuers. Where'd she go? She can't have gotten far. Spread out and find her. I stayed perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Minutes ticked by like hours. I could hear them searching, their voices sometimes fading, sometimes growing alarmingly close. As the initial surge of adrenaline wore off, the reality of my situation began to sink in. I was trapped in a cave, being hunted by armed men, miles from any help. My phone had no signal this deep in the wilderness. No one knew exactly where I was or when to expect me back. I was on my own. As night fell, the temperature dropped. I huddled in my cave, shivering, straining my ears for any sound of my pursuers. They were still out there. I could hear them occasionally, their flashlight beams sweeping across the forest floor. I knew I couldn't stay in the cave forever. I needed to find a way out of these woods to get to safety and alert the authorities. But how? As I sat there, my mind racing through possibilities, I remembered something from my many hiking trips. Search and rescue often used rivers as landmarks. If I could find the stream I'd been looking for earlier, I might be able to follow it out of the forest. It was risky. I'd have to leave the safety of my hiding spot and navigate in the dark. But it was the only plan I had. I waited until the forest had been quiet for a while, then slowly, painfully, squeezed out of the crevice. The night was pitch black, the canopy above blocking out any moonlight. I took a deep breath, oriented myself as best I could, and started moving. Every step was agonizing. I had to move slowly to avoid making noise, but every moment I was exposed felt like an eternity. More than once, I froze at the sound of a snapping twig or rustling leaves. Sure, I'd been discovered. After what felt like hours, I heard it, the faint sound of running water. Hope surged through me, giving me a second wind. I quickened my pace and following the sound. I was so focused on the stream that I almost missed the voices. I dropped to the ground just as a flashlight beam swept over the spot where I'd been standing. I'm telling you, I heard something. Probably just an animal. The girl's long gone by now. Boss ain't gonna like that. You know what was in those crates? If she talks, my breath caught in my throat. Whatever was in those crates, it was big. Big enough that these men were willing to kill to keep it secret. I lay there, barely breathing, as the men moved past me. Once I was sure they were gone, I crawled towards the stream, staying low to the ground. When I reached the water, I nearly cried with relief. It wasn't much, just a small creek really, but it was flowing downhill. Civilization would be downhill. I began to follow the stream, moving as quickly as I dared. The sound of the water masked my movements, and I made better time than I had in the forest. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I heard a sound that made my heart soar. Cars, a road. I was close to civilization. I quickened my pace, hope giving me strength I didn't know I had left. The trees began to thin, and suddenly, I was there. A 2-lane highway stretched out before Maine, blessedly empty in the early morning light. I wanted to collapse right there on the asphalt, but I knew I couldn't stop. Not yet. I needed to get help, to tell someone about what I'd seen. I started walking, my thumb out, praying for a car to come by. After what felt like an eternity, I saw headlights approaching. An old pickup truck slowed to a stop beside me. An elderly man peered out at me, concern etched on his weathered face. "You all right, miss? You look like you've been through hell." I probably looked a mess. Clothes torn, scratched and bruised, wild-eyed with exhaustion and fear. But at that moment, this kind stranger was the most beautiful sight I'd ever seen. "Please," I said, my voice hoarse from dehydration and fear. "I need help. I need to call the police." He didn't ask questions, just nodded and unlocked the passenger door. As we drove towards the nearest town, I told him the abbreviated version of what had happened. He listened silently, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. When we reached the local police station, he insisted on coming in with me. "Just to make sure you're okay," he said gruffly. The next few hours were a blur of questions and statements. Local police warned, then state troopers, then the FBI. I told my story over and over, marking locations on maps, describing what I'd seen in that clearing. They found the camp, but it had been abandoned. The crates, the weapons, the men, all gone. But they found enough evidence to back up my story. Bullet casings that matched the shots fired at me. Traces of whatever had been in those crates. Something highly illegal, they said, though they wouldn't give me specifics. As I sat in the police station, wrapped in a shock blanket and sipping terrible coffee, the reality of what I'd gone through started to settle in. I'd stumbled upon a major criminal operation. I'd been hunted, shot at, nearly killed, and I'd survived. The FBI agent in charge approached me, a look of begrudging respect on his face. "You did good out there," he said. "Not many people would have made it out of those woods alive." I nodded, too drained to speak. He continued, "We're going to need to put you in protective custody for a while, just until we're sure it's safe." Part of me wanted to protest. I had a life, a job, friends, and family who would worry. But a bigger part of me knew he was right. The men in the woods were still out there, and they knew what I looked like. As I was led out of the station to a waiting SUV with tinted windows, I took one last look at the mountains in the distance. They'd always been my sanctuary, a place to escape the stresses of everyday life. Now they loomed ominously, hiding dangers I had never imagined. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if I'd ever feel safe in the wilderness again, but I did know one thing. I was alive. Against all odds, I'd survived. And whatever came next, I'd face it with the same determination that had carried me out of those woods. As the SUV pulled away, heading toward an uncertain future, I made a silent promise to myself. I would not let fear win. Someday, somehow, I'd find my way back to the trails, because those mountains had tried to kill me, but they'd also shown me just how strong I could be. And that was a lesson worth nearly dying for. Exhaustion can mess with your mind, but it can't unlock a door you know you've locked. It can't leave muddy footprints on a carpet you've never touched. And it certainly can't create the sensation of being watched in an empty room. That night at the motel, I realized that sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones lurking under your bed, but the ones who hold the key to your room. I'd been driving for 14 hours straight, my eyes stinging from the endless highway and my back sore from too many hours hunched over the wheel. The neon sign of the Sleepy Pine Motel shone like a lighthouse in the night, offering a bed and a few hours of much-needed rest before I had to hit the road again. The night clerk barely glanced up from his magazine as I checked in, sliding a key across the counter with a mumbled, "Room 104. I nodded my thanks, too exhausted for small talk, and made my way to the parking lot. The room was exactly what you'd expect from a budget motel in the middle of nowhere. Faded wallpaper, a lumpy bed, and a lingering smell of stale cigarette smoke that no air freshener could cover. But at that moment, it looked like luxury to my weary eyes. Out of habit, I quickly scanned the room, checking the locks on the door and window, peeking behind the shower curtain. Satisfied everything was secure, I tossed my bag onto the chair and collapsed onto the bed, not even bothering to remove my shoes. I must have fallen asleep the moment my head hit the pillow, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake, my heart racing. Something had woken me, but in that hazy space between sleep and wakefulness, I couldn't recall what it was. The room was dark, with only the red glow from the neon sign outside filtering through the thin curtains. As I lay there, trying to calm my racing heart, I heard it, a soft click, like someone trying to turn a doorknob slowly. My breath hitched in my chest. I held my breath, sure I was imagining things, but then I heard it again, a little louder this time. I sat up, my eyes fixed on the door. The handle jiggled once, then twice, followed by silence. "Hello," I called out, my voice small and trembling in the quiet room. No answer. I slid out of bed, my feet hitting the carpet with a soft thud. That's when I felt it, dampness soaking through my socks. Confused, I reached for the bedside lamp and flicked it on. My heart nearly stopped. There, leading from the door to the bed, was a trail of muddy footprints. Footprints that weren't mine. I staggered backward, almost tripping over my own feet. This couldn't be happening. I had to be dreaming, but the cold, damp carpet under my feet felt far too real. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, ready to call for help. But as I unlocked the screen, a chill ran down my spine. It was 3:07 a.m. I had been asleep for over 4 hours. 4 hours in which someone had been in my room. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't safe here. I needed to leave now. I grabbed my bag, not bothering to check if I had everything. As I reached for the door handle, I hesitated. What if they were still out there waiting? But staying in this room felt like being trapped in a cage. Taking a deep breath, I yanked the door open, ready to make a run for it. The parking lot was empty, eerily quiet under the flickering neon light. My car sat where I had left it, a comforting sight in the sea of uncertainty. I sprinted across the parking lot, fumbling with my keys. Just as I reached my car, I heard it. Footsteps, fast and heavy, coming from the direction of my room. I didn't look back. I threw myself into the driver's seat, jammed the key into the ignition, and peeled out of the parking lot with a screech of tires. As I sped down the dark highway, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, I glanced in the rear-view mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road, watching my car disappear into the night. But when I looked again, the road behind me was empty. I drove for hours, too scared to stop, jumping at every shadow and sound. When the sun finally rose, I pulled into a busy truck stop. The normality of morning commuters and tired truckers a balm to my frayed nerves. As I sat there, nursing a cup of terrible coffee, I tried to make sense of what had happened. Had I imagined it all? Was it just an especially vivid nightmare brought on by exhaustion? But then I looked down and saw the mud still caked on my socks. This was no dream. I never reported what happened. Who would believe me? A locked room? Mysterious footprints? A vanishing intruder? It sounded like the plot of a bad horror movie. But I know what I saw, what I felt. Now, years later, I still can't shake the memory of that night. I avoid motels whenever possible, preferring to sleep in my car at rest stops if I have to. And every night, just before I fall asleep, I check the locks. Twice. Because I know now that sometimes locks aren't enough to keep the monsters out. But the thing that haunts me most, the question that keeps me up at night, is this. What if the footprints hadn't woken me up? What was the intruder planning to do? And most chillingly of all, how many other people have slept in that room, blissfully unaware of the danger lurking in the shadows? I'll never know the answers to these questions. But one thing's for certain, I'll never forget the night I learned that sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't what you can see, but what you can't. The presence you feel but can't explain. The eyes you know are watching even when the room is empty. So the next time you're in a motel room and you hear that soft click in the middle of the night, remember my story, check the locks, and maybe, just maybe, sleep with one eye open because you never know who might have the key to your room. As for me, I've learned to live with the paranoia, the constant need to look over my shoulder. It's a small price to pay for survival because I know that somewhere out there, in a nameless town off some forgotten highway, there's a motel room with muddy footprints leading to an empty bed, and someone or something is still waiting for its next unsuspecting guest. I often wonder about that night clerk, about whether he knew what was happening in room 104. Was he complicit, or was he just another piece in a puzzle he didn't understand? I've thought about going back, confronting him, demanding answers, but then I remember the sound of those footsteps, chasing me across the parking lot, and I know I can never go back. Sometimes, late at night when the world is still, I replay every detail of that night in my mind. The click of the door handle, the damp carpet beneath my feet, the figure I saw in the rearview mirror. And I wonder, what if I hadn't woken up? What if I had slept through the night, unaware of the intruder in my room? Would I have ever realized they were there? Or would I have simply become another missing person, another unsolved mystery? Those thoughts used to keep me awake at night, but now I've learned to use them as a reminder to stay alert, trust my instincts, and never take my safety for granted. Because I know now that the world is full of dark corners and hidden dangers. And sometimes, The only thing standing between you and the unimaginable is a flimsy lock and your own awareness. So if you ever find yourself in a motel room, feeling that unsettling sense of unease, don't ignore it. Don't brush it off as paranoia or an overactive imagination, because sometimes, just sometimes, those feelings are trying to warn you. And from what I've learned, it's always better to be safe than sorry. After all, you never know who might have the key to your room. I always thought I knew my neighborhood like the back of my hand. Every street, every corner, every shortcut. But on that moonless night, as footsteps echoed behind me and familiar roads twisted into an endless maze, I realized just how little I truly understood the dark corners of my own backyard. It had been a long night at the office. By the time I left, the streets were deserted. The last few stragglers from nearby bars were long gone. I decided to walk home, hoping the cool night air would help clear my mind. It was a route I'd taken 100 times before. A straight shot through residential areas that would get me home in 20 minutes. The first few blocks were uneventful. Streetlights cast pools of yellow light on the sidewalk, and the hum of distant traffic provided a comforting urban lullaby. I was lost in thought, mentally going over tomorrow's to-do list, when I first heard it, footsteps, just slightly out of sync with my own. I glanced over my shoulder, but the street behind me was empty. Shaking my head, I pressed on. Probably just an echo, I thought, or maybe a cat prowling the night. But the footsteps continued, growing slightly louder with each passing minute. I quickened my pace, my heart rate matching my steps. Another look back showed nothing but shadows. I turned onto Cedar Street, a quiet residential road lined with old Victorian houses. As I passed beneath a flickering streetlight, something made my blood run cold. A figure, tall and lean, stood at the far end of the block. Even from this distance, I could feel their eyes locked onto me. My fight-or-flight instinct kicked in, and I chose flight. I turned sharply onto Maple Avenue, a street I knew would lead me straight home. But as I hurried along, something didn't feel right. The houses looked different, older, more rundown than I remembered. Had I taken a wrong turn? The footsteps behind me grew louder, more insistent. I broke into a run, no longer caring how foolish I looked. All I wanted was to get home, lock my door, and forget this night ever happened. I turned onto what I thought was my street, only to find myself facing an unfamiliar cul-de-sac. Panic began to creep in. How could this be? I'd lived in this neighborhood for years. There shouldn't be streets I didn't recognize. The sound of footsteps was much closer now, echoing off the houses around me. I spun around, ready to confront whoever was following, but the street behind me was as empty as the one ahead. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" No response, just the faint rustle of leaves in the night breeze. I pulled out my phone, hoping to call for help or at least use the GPS to figure out where I was. But the screen stayed stubbornly dark. Dead battery. Of all the nights for this to happen. With no other choice, I pressed on, trying to retrace my steps. But every turn I took led me deeper into unfamiliar territory. Streets I'd never seen before stretched out in front of me, lined with houses that seemed to leer in the darkness. The footsteps continued, sometimes fading into the distance only to return louder than ever. I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. A shadow darting between houses, a figure watching from a darkened window. But every time I turned to look, there was nothing there. Hours seemed to pass as I wandered through this twisted version of my neighborhood. My feet ached, my throat was dry from panic, and exhaustion tugged at the edges of my consciousness. But still, I couldn't find my way home. As I turned yet another corner, I saw something that made my heart leap. A familiar street sign. Elm Street, my street. Relief flooded through me as I started down the road, my pace quickening with each step. But as I approached my house, that relief turned to icy dread. The building before me looked like my home, but wrong. The paint was peeling, the windows dark and empty. The neat front lawn I'd mowed just last weekend was overgrown, weeds choking out the carefully tended flowers. I stood there, staring at this nightmare version of my house, when I heard it. Footsteps, right behind me. I whirled around ready to face my pursuer, but what I saw defied explanation. The street behind me was gone, replaced by an impenetrable wall of darkness. And emerging from that darkness was a figure. No, multiple figures. Shadowy, featureless forms that moved with an unnatural grace. Terror unlike anything I'd ever known gripped me. I ran, no longer caring about direction or logic. I just needed to get away, to escape this impossible, nightmarish version of my neighborhood. Streets blurred past as I fled, each one stranger and more twisted than the last. Houses loomed overhead, their architecture growing more bizarre with each block. I passed by buildings that seemed to defy gravity, streets that looped back on themselves in impossible ways. And always the footsteps followed. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to lose all meaning in this labyrinthine nightmare. But eventually, my legs gave out, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. As I lay there waiting for the shadows to overtake me, I heard something new, a voice calling my name. Tom, Tom, wake up. The world around me began to blur and fade. The twisted houses, the impossible streets, all of it dissolved into a swirling mist. I opened my eyes to find myself at my desk at work, my colleague shaking my shoulder gently. You were having quite a nightmare, she said, concern etched on her face. Are you okay? I nodded, still disoriented, my heart racing from the lingering fear of the dream. Yep. I'm fine, just a bad dream. As I gathered my things to head home, relief washed over me. It had all been a dream, a terrifying, vivid dream, but a dream nonetheless. But as I stepped out of the office into the dark night, a chill ran down my spine. The streets looked different, unfamiliar in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. As I walked, the sense of unease grew stronger, and I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere behind me, just out of sight, footsteps echoed in the darkness. I quickened my pace, suddenly desperate to get home and lock my door. But with each turn, the streets seemed to shift and change. What should have been familiar landmarks were distorted, like reflections in a funhouse mirror. Panic began to creep in as I realized I didn't recognize where I was. This couldn't be happening. It had to be a dream, right? But the sound of footsteps growing closer told me otherwise. This was real, somehow impossibly, terrifyingly real. I broke into a run, no longer concerned with looking foolish or attracting attention. All I wanted was to get home, to escape this nightmare that had somehow spilled into the waking world. But with each turn, each frantic sprint down streets I didn't recognize, I knew the truth. I was lost, trapped in a maze of my own neighborhood, with something dark and unknowable pursuing me. And as the footsteps grew ever closer, I realized that sometimes the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones that hide under our beds or in our closets. Sometimes, they're the ones that twist the familiar into the unrecognizable, that turn our safe havens into terrifying labyrinths. I'm still running, still trying to find my way home. And I know that somewhere, in the warped streets of this nightmare version of my neighborhood, those footsteps are still following, waiting for the moment I slow down, waiting for the instant I drop my guard. So I keep moving, keep searching for an escape from this maze. Because I know that if I stop, if I let those footsteps catch up to me, I may never find my way home again. And in the back of my mind, a chilling thought lingers. What if I'm not the only one trapped here? What if there are others, lost in their own familiar yet foreign neighborhoods, running from footsteps that never tire, never slow? So if you ever find yourself on a dark street that should feel familiar but doesn't, if you hear footsteps echoing behind you in the night, remember my story and run, and pray you find your way home before the darkness swallows you whole. When I was around 22 or 23, I had the privilege of working as a paid professional stage actor. It was one of the best jobs I've ever had, with the exception of one unsettling experience. The theater I worked in had a reputation for being haunted. Now, after what I went through, I can say with some certainty that it was haunted. Unless, of course, what I experienced was something that I'll never be able to explain, no matter how much time passes. To give some background, the building that housed the theater was once a library, back in the 1920s and 30s. That all changed after a young girl was tragically assaulted and murdered, left in the middle of an aisle upstairs, unnoticed by anyone. Naturally, the library was shut down immediately after that incident. It became quite infamous. Decades later, in the 1960s, the old library was repurposed into a roundstage theater, complete with a catwalk near the ceiling. Even before I got cast in the show, I'd heard rumors about the theater being haunted. I was curious, of course, but I knew better than to tempt whatever spirits might be lingering by mocking or taunting them. That's just bad energy. So, I chose to ignore the stories and the ghostly tales that surrounded the place. The stories were always the same from the other actors who had worked there. "It's a little girl," they'd say. "She doesn't like women," they'd add. "She's got a thing for certain guys," they'd finish. That was the gossip among the staff. Now, while I was in the production, I worked alongside a fellow cast member who was absolutely stunning. Smart, talented, and a fantastic dancer. She had everything going for her. A real Wonder Woman, if you will. She was also incredibly short, standing at a mere 4'9". I don't like to call people tiny or small, but let's be real. Jules was quite short, but don't let that fool you. She could still kick your butt. Always be wary of dancers, especially the petite ones. They have strength and discipline. Jules and I are still friends to this day, and she once shared a story with me that stuck with me. About 20 minutes before a show, she was in the women's dressing room, sitting on a chair, combing her hair, and looking at herself in the mirror after finishing her makeup. Then, out of nowhere, she felt a strong tug on her hair, pulling her off the chair and onto the floor. She insists she was alone in the room, and to this day, she can't explain it. Jules isn't the kind of person to make up stories, and she's certainly no liar. So, of course, we all believed her. There was also Kodai, a really handsome guy who started losing his mind over his missing props and costumes. Things would just vanish without explanation. He'd frantically search before every show, yelling, "I had my bench right here. My shoes were over there. Why are they gone? I swear I didn't move them." Every night, he'd be in a panic before the curtain went up. It was bizarre. There was a kid. I forget his name, but he played the young boy in the show. And always he would say, every night during intermission, I am standing backstage waiting for my cue to walk on stage for the beginning of Act 2. There is a breathing thrust upon the back of my neck, and every single time I turn my head, there's nothing there. And I'm scared. This poor kid was probably about 12 or 13 at best. And to me, when I was about 23, well, to me it sounded terrifying. Savannah was my scene partner, and she and I had gone to high school together, so the camaraderie was already there. So when she told me that she felt terrified to be alone in the theater, I believed her. She had a part of Act 2 where she was required to be on the catwalk to drop a long canvas that was a sort of the backdrop visually for a scene. Savannah would get tired though, and while she would lay there on the catwalk hoping not to be seen, she would accidentally start to fall asleep. If she fell asleep, the production would have consequences if the scene change could not happen. Every night, she said to me, every night I fall asleep, and then moments before my cue, I hear a little girl's voice say, "Coo coo coo Lulu," and then I wake up and drop the canvas sheet and get back downstairs to make sure I get on stage on time. Every single night this happens. So onward onto my part of the story and/or experience. There was this matinee on a Saturday. After the matinee, we got our dinner break, and the entire cast would go take dinner and converse and enjoy ourselves. We had our 8 o'clock show and another at midnight. I decided to head back to the theater building early so I might pass out on the couch and sleep for a few hours before I had to get back into costume. Yada yada. Saying that, it must be made clear that I had had the keys to the building, and I could open up the theater doors once I approached the theater doors. I was actually trusted enough for that. Perhaps that was a curse within its very own self. Logically, the first task I always presented myself with was to turn on all the lights around the building, which I did this evening. There was a bathroom downstairs and there was a bathroom upstairs. For an inexplicable reason to me, some thought in my head that I had, that I still cannot explain even to this day, I decided to use the upstairs bathroom, which was located by the costume storage. I had never really used it before, and it does not seem sensical to me, but that was the choice that I had made. I marched up the curling, winding, spiraling stairs built way back in the day. I turned on the lights upstairs and proceeded down the hallway and into the bathroom and turned on the bathroom lights. Felt off to me. The air, the energy, the spirit of it all. It was very strange to me. It was very unsettling, unnerving, and awkward. I figured it was due to me being completely alone in the theater building, especially at nighttime. Only then did thoughts enter my mind. As a little girl, they'd all say. She doesn't like women, they'd all say. She has crushes on certain boys, they'd all say. Reasonably, the thoughts put me on edge and I got super nervous, like shivering at a cold chill that was absent from the room. When I had finished with my business, consistently looking back behind me, I opened the bathroom door to find that all of the lights had been shut off. The entirety of the theater was pitch black with the exception of the bathroom, whereupon I just turned on the lights. Through that little light protruding from the bathroom, it traced along the hallway, and looking down it, I saw the silhouette of Jules. I said to myself playfully. She turned off the lights and wants to fool around. I had been feeling tired and sort of wanted to nap, but no young man in his right mind turns down the opportunity to get in on some frisky action, especially when such an attractive lady is insisting. I marked where she was standing in the hallway, and as the door closed behind me and the hallway became breached with complete darkness, I had already calculated where she was standing, saying, "Hey you." As I approached where she stood, I put my arms out for an embrace. There was no response, though. There was nothing there. "Oh, I see," I said excitedly. "You want to play games with me?" So I walked further and further down the hallway, putting my hands out in front of me. I realized I had made it to the costume storage. Racks and racks of old clothes and wardrobe and costumes, aisles and aisles of them. In the complete darkness, I put my hands here and there, feeling my way around, touching the fabrics that hung on their hangers on the racks. Expecting to find Jules, it ended up just resulting in more searching. "Where are you?" I asked. "Come on. Where are you?" That was when it started to sink in. That's when it hit me. There was this overwhelming sensation of being watched, as if something or someone was aware of my every move. A heavy sense of dread crept into my veins, and I felt an instant wave of fear. Then came the giggle, not a full laugh, but a soft, childish giggle. "Who's there? Who's that?" I asked aloud, my voice shaky. Suddenly, a jacket or something similar fell from its hanger and draped itself over my shoulders. My heart raced. I can't even remember if I screamed, but I knew one thing for sure. I ran. In the dark, I collided with dozens of clothing racks, sending them toppling to the floor. Took me a moment to regain my bearings, to figure out where I was. When I finally spotted the spiral staircase, I hurried toward it, only to lose my balance and tumble down the stairs, crashing to the ground like a rag doll. A sharp moan escaped me as I felt as though I'd cracked a rib, but I quickly got up, disoriented, running into a few walls before I finally reached the front doors. I yanked them open and dashed outside, not caring that I left them unlocked. Out in the parking lot, the whole cast and crew was arriving. Among them was Jules, but there was no way she had been in the theater. I called out to her, breathless. "Hey, did you just mess with me?" "What? No," she replied, looking at me curiously. "What are you talking about?" "I thought I saw you in there," I told her, panic rising. "You turned off the lights." The stage manager overheard and simply nodded, unbothered. "Oh, that's just the ghost. If she turns off the lights, it just means she likes you," he said matter-of-factly. That was the first and only strange experience I had with the ghost. After that, nothing happened again. But every now and then, I find myself wondering what really happened that night. Was it all in my head? A trick of the light? It's strange to think about, especially when so many others had odd encounters while I never did. Why did it happen when I was completely alone? And why, of all things, was it a little girl? The stories were always the same. She didn't like women. She had crushes on certain boys. As flattered as I should have been, I'm still haunted by the memory, and to this day, I get chills whenever I think about it. I never worked at that theater again. My mother was a single parent raising 6 kids, 5 girls and 1 boy. I was the youngest. From an early age, all of us became attuned to the paranormal. This happened in Hollywood, California during the late 60s. My mom knew we were different from other families, and she was always supportive, never wanting to suppress our abilities. She'd only tell us not to talk about it to others, fearing they'd think we were crazy. Looking back, I understand her reasoning in many ways. One thing she often said has stayed with me: people don't like what they can't understand. At the time, we were renting a house on Alexandria, but the owners wanted to move back in, so we had to find a new place. Mom worked during the day, so the only time she could look for rental houses was at night. All 6 of us would squeeze into this big yellow wood-paneled station wagon, and off we would go. The adventure into the night began. More often than not, one of the houses we visited would have an unlocked door, which was common for the time. We were all armed with flashlights, but we had to be quiet. The scariest moments were when no doors were open. So, being the smallest, my brother would help me climb through a window so I could run to the door and open it for everyone. Now that I'm reflecting on this, I realize that was pretty much breaking and entering. If any house made any of us uncomfortable, Mom would cross it off the list and move on. It was difficult to find a place big enough for all of us, especially one that my mom could afford. One day, I came home from school to find all our things being moved to the house directly across the street, where a mysterious old woman with her windows blacked out lived in the back. I finally found my mom and asked her what was going on. She told me she'd found a really good deal on the house and couldn't pass it up. Her only warning was to stay away from that old lady. The house was an old 2-story with wood floors, 1 bathroom, and 3 bedrooms. Originally, it had 4 bedrooms, but one of them had been divided into a small space to accommodate another tenant, the old lady. I should mention that I was very small for my age, and the house seemed huge to me. With all the commotion downstairs, my mom was understandably distracted. I asked her why she didn't let me check the house for anything bad first, and she said, "Look, baby, there wasn't any time. It was a good deal and I had to take it. Why don't you check it out now?" Feeling very important, I went off to investigate. I went into the kitchen, big. I went into the dining room, fancy, and then I started up the stairs. Mom mentioned that there was a bedroom big enough for all my sisters, a place for all my toys in the hall, and a room for my brothers, so I was excited to see this. The staircase was enclosed with a door at the bottom. You went up 4 steps to a landing where it turned and then proceeded up from there. I got up to the top step when they got me. It felt like 3 cold hands quickly one after the other around my throat with such force. I tried to scream, but the grip was getting tighter. I thought my vocal cords were being crushed. They started forcing me backward and I felt like I was going to fall, but they just held me there for what seemed like forever in my mind. My toes teetering on the edge of the top step. I couldn't move. It felt like surges of electricity throughout my body. Then they started guiding me backwards down the steps, fearing at any moment I was going to be thrown. I saw little spurts of my own breath coming from my nose. As they were guiding me down, I could feel only the edge of the steps graze the tips of my toes while I was trying to grip one of them onto each step. They got me to the landing and up at the wall. It felt like 1,000 weights were pressed against my chest, still hardly touching the floor. I was starting to pass out when I heard a voice in my head say to me, "You are strong. You have faith." I saw a white glowing light all around me, and I said the only word that came to my mind, the universal sound of God. They then lessened their grip ever so slightly, but it was enough for me to drop to the floor and run down to my mother. "Please, Mom. Please, we can't live here. Please." I told her what happened, but she said it was too late. We had nowhere else to go. It wasn't long before everyone else in the family had their own experiences. We all hated that house, but we had to endure it until we could afford to move again. My brother liked to tinker, take things apart, and see how they worked, if you will. He took the time to sometimes share that part of his life with me. I'd like to think that's where I got my inventor's mind and my ability to fix almost anything. He set up a workshop under the stairs in the basement. I sometimes found some of my electronic toys being dissected and put back together on that workbench. One day, I was looking for one of my toys and suspected I knew right where to look, but I was too scared to go down into the basement alone. So I took my trusted cat, Frischka. He'll protect me, I thought. I started down the stairs with my cat in my arms. I got almost to the bottom of the step when the light went out and the door to the house slammed shut. Scared to death, I felt for the railing and started to run back up when I saw something. Normally, you could see the moonlight from under the house through the vents to the outside. Something moving was blocking the light out and quickly coming towards me. It almost looked like billowing black smoke from the back of the house. Just then my loving cat, Frischka, hissed and clawed me to get away. He jumped from my arms and escaped through one of the grates on the other side. I ran up the stairs as fast as I could with my heart pounding out of my chest. I grabbed the door handle and jiggling it back and forth thinking it was stuck. I heard a loud long exhale behind me followed by the smell of rotten eggs. The door finally opened and I slammed and locked it behind me. When I told my brother, he said that he never felt good down there and he kept the door always locked after that. My family was very involved in the church. We cleaned it every Saturday and helped with all the events and variety shows. Funny thing was that our family was so big it felt like we were the variety show. One such day, they were all at church doing something. I don't remember what. I had just arrived home from school and someone, I think one of my sisters, was supposed to be there to greet me. Now this event happened in the hall. As you walked through the dining room on the left, you walked into the hall. You turned right and on the left is the boarded up wall to the tenant's dwelling behind us. That evil old lady. Just thinking about her now gives me chills. And straight ahead was the bathroom. If you turn left in the hall, you see my mom's room that she and I shared together. Next to that, the door to the upstairs, and in the middle, the door to under the house. Well, no one was there and I wasn't going to stay in the house alone. So I walked in the hall and sat on the phone bench. For those of you who don't know what it is, it looks like it's a wooden end table with a padded seat on it so you can talk on a corded phone. Anyway, earlier I saw my friend's dad's car parked across the street, so I knew my friend was home. I figured I could call him and hang out there. I could just wait for someone to come home. As I am sitting there, I hear crackling coming from upstairs. It must have been one of my siblings, I thought, so I went to the bottom of the stairs and leaned in on one foot. Who's up there? The crackling stopped. Thinking they didn't hear me, I yelled again, this time calling out a few of my sister's names. Still nothing, so I sat back down on the bench and waited for them to come down. It was quiet, not a sound. Just then, to the right of me, it sounded like someone was pressing their body against the other side of the boarded-up wall listening. Then a muffled, quiet, evil giggle. Felt off, really off. The crackling noise started back up again, now coming from the top of the stairs, followed by an ear-piercing ringing inside my head. Feeling uncomfortable, I picked up the phone, not taking my eyes up that staircase. I dialed my friend's number, and before I could even say hello, I could see it as it turned the corner of the staircase. It was huge. It didn't have a human form. There were what looked like hundreds of eyes all over. It was pulsating red to amber. Then deafening sound crackling was coming from it with sparks flashing all over its form. It was slowly gliding down the stairs coming towards me. I then heard more prominent laughter, almost like a cackle coming from behind that wall. Then I ran. I dropped the phone and ran straight over to my friend's house until someone came home. Now please keep in mind that we only lasted 6 months in this house. So these are all the events that I know of within that time frame and was confirmed to me by my siblings firsthand. A brief description of where this next event took place: it was the second floor. Standing at the top of the stairs to the left toward the back of the house was my brother's room. Inside the door to the right was a short wall and the foot of his bed. Alongside of his bed was a window. All of his beds in our house always faced east, then the desk next to his bed, then an open space at the back corner of the closet. On the right of the stairs was all of my sister's room. It was long and big and set up as follows. Closet to the far right, then line from right to left, for single mattresses on the floor next to each other with all heads to the east, then a window. My family were all avid readers. Well, that's pretty much all you could do back then. Late one night about 2 a.m., My sisters were all laying on their beds reading when my brother burst open the door white as a ghost, grabbing his neck, gasping for air, frantically telling them all to go downstairs. He briefly shared his experience, then ran out of the room. At that point, he ran downstairs to wake up my mother. I witnessed this because I shared a room with her. Actually, one of the beds upstairs was supposed to be mine, but I always complain about seeing a man hanging from a rope over the staircase landing. Plus, I had too many experiences up there myself. The door swung open, slamming against the wall. He was standing there in a white t-shirt and PJ pants. There was no color in his face, and his neck looked like it was on fire. He said that he was just falling asleep when he felt a negative presence. Something caught his eye in the back corner of the room. It was the full-body apparition of an old man, and there was hate emanating from him. He started to sit up, but the man flew at him from across the room. He tried to describe it as it was quick, like 1 second he was there, and the next he was on top of him so fast the curtains and everything else in the room were affected like a big burst of wind. He grabbed his neck with both hands gripping tight and was choking the life out of him. He said he was nose to nose with this thing and to this day can't shake the evil image of his face. My sister and I both remember him saying at that time that the man in a guttural voice said, "I want your body." My mother put a cold rag on his neck and calmed him down. We all remember dark bruises in the shape of 2 hands stayed on his neck and chest for over a week, and he never slept upstairs again. Through the years, he never wanted to talk about this until I told him I was writing our story. Now on that night, all my sisters brought down their bedding except one. She was headstrong and stubborn. She was the cut the nonsense, it's all in your head type of person until it happened to her. My eldest sister tried warning her that on numerous occasions she saw something dark lurking in the closet. And then one night she woke up to something pressing in on her while she was sleeping. But that didn't deter her. We were all dramatic and crazy. She was happy. She got that big room all to herself. Well, one day she was upstairs taking a nap. She never slept without the fan on. The fan was located all the way across the room in front of that closet. The fan was round in the shape of a fat can. It was about 17 inches tall and 14 inches wide with slats going around it about 2 inches apart with big metal blades. My sister always slept with her arm extended out from under her pillow. She said that she was sound asleep. All of a sudden, she woke up to her finger being sliced by the blades of the fan in extreme pain. She pulled her hand out of the fan and ran downstairs to our mother. I remember that there was a lot of blood. My mother then wrapped her hand with gauze and papaya so as to eliminate scarring, and we all went up to investigate. The fan was still there, but it was unplugged. We couldn't figure out how it even ended up by her bed. We had shag carpeting in the 60s, so it couldn't have vibrated over. Plus, it would have had to cross over some clothes, which would have stopped the fan about 5 feet away from the bed. After experiencing something like that, and knowing your whole family is sleeping downstairs together, and then realizing the fan was unplugged, wouldn't that make you join them downstairs in the living room? But not her. She stayed in that room for about a month until she couldn't deny it anymore. By then, she had made the room her own, taking 2 mattresses, stacking them on top of each other, and placing them under the window. She told me she was just starting to drift into a dream state when she was suddenly jolted awake by pressure on her chest. It felt dark and evil, and she couldn't move. As all these thoughts raced through her mind, she remembered something our minister had told us during a counseling session about the house. He had said to try communicating with whatever was there and ask if it would follow her spirit guide into the light. But as she tried that, the pressure only intensified. The more love she tried to send out, the heavier it got. She said it felt like a cement slab crushing her, squeezing the air out of her lungs. I asked her how she managed to get out from under it, and she said she prayed and repeated the things our minister had taught us to say, and slowly the pressure lifted. From that point on, she slept in the living room with the rest of us. We later learned that a man had hanged himself on the staircase, and someone else had shot themselves in the upstairs closet. As for the old woman living in the back of the house, she was a severe alcoholic who practiced the dark arts and voodoo. She had blacked out all her windows to keep the energy in the house happy, or so she claimed to the neighbor. People just thought she was a crazy old lady, and no one took her seriously. I often wondered who she had been before all of this, and what happened in her life to turn her so dark. What had been so terrible in her past that it drove her to torment others, especially innocent children? Was the evil presence in my brother's room somehow connected to her? I guess I'll never know. Our minister had told us that the house could never truly be cleansed until she was gone. The vintage camera felt unnervingly heavy in my hands, as if it carried the weight of untold secrets within its metal frame. I'd found it at a dusty flea market, its retro appeal drawing me in, and the sellers swore it still worked perfectly. But when I peered through the viewfinder for the first time, a chill ran down my spine. The world through that lens was off somehow. Shadows were deeper, colors more intense. And in the corner of the frame, I could have sworn I saw a figure, a presence that wasn't there when I lowered the camera. Little did I know, this seemingly innocent purchase was about to drag me into a nightmare where the line between reality and the supernatural would blur like an overexposed photo. My name is Michael, and I've always had a deep fascination with photography. There's something almost magical about capturing a fleeting moment, freezing it forever. So when I spotted the old Leica M3 at Mrs. Donovan's stall, I couldn't resist. The price was high, but the camera was in surprisingly good condition for its age. "Oh, that old thing," Mrs. Donovan had said, her wide eyes twinkling. "Found it at an estate sale. The previous owner was quite the artist, they say. Captured things that no one else could see." I should have noticed how her hands trembled as she handed it to me, or the look of relief in her eyes as I walked away. But I was too caught up in my excitement over the find to pay attention. At home, I examined my prize more closely. The camera was indeed in great shape, with only a few minor scratches on the body. To my surprise, there was still film inside. Curious if it would still work, I finished off the roll with a few test shots around my apartment. I had a small darkroom set up in my spare bathroom, another one of my hobbies. As I developed the film, a sense of childlike anticipation filled me. What kind of images had the previous owner captured? What hidden stories did they tell? The first few photos were nothing special. Landscapes, cityscapes, ordinary scenes. But as I hung them to dry, I noticed something strange in the next image. It was a busy street scene, people walking by, but one figure stood out. A woman, staring directly at the camera, her face frozen in terror. The odd part was that she looked blurred, almost translucent, as though she was fading away. I shook my head, blaming it on the quirks of the old film. But then came the next photo, and it made my blood run cold. It was a picture of a park I often visited. At first glance, everything seemed normal. But in the background, partially obscured by a tree, was a figure. Tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its face was blurry, but I could make out what appeared to be a wide, sinister grin. My hands trembled as I developed the rest of the roll. Each photo was eerily similar. At first glance, they seemed like ordinary scenes, but always with some nightmarish figure lurking in the background. In the final photo, taken in my own living room, the entity was front and center. Its face was clearer now, a twisted parody of human features, its eyes dark pits that seemed to stare right through me. I stared at the photos for hours, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was impossible, and yet the evidence was right there in front of me. Somehow, this camera was capturing things that shouldn't exist. Things that lurked just beyond the edge of normal perception. That night, I barely slept. I tossed and turned, my dreams filled with shadowy figures and that leering, inhuman grin. When I finally dragged myself out of bed the next morning, I was determined to uncover the truth about this camera. I started with an internet search, looking for any information about haunted or cursed cameras. Most of what I found was obviously fake, stories made up for clicks or views. But buried in a forum thread, I found a post that made my heart race. The Leica M3, serial number 70358. If you have it, get rid of it now before they notice you. The user had deleted their account shortly after posting, but it was enough to confirm my worst fears. I checked the serial number on my camera, 70358, exactly the same. I knew I should destroy it, smash it to pieces, burn the film, and forget I'd ever seen those horrifying images. But curiosity, that dangerous, irresistible force, propelled me forward. I had to know more. I spent the next few days digging deeper, reaching out to photography experts and paranormal researchers alike. Most dismissed me outright, but a few seemed intrigued. One historian even agreed to meet with me. Dr. Eleanor Vance was a small, bird-like woman with sharp eyes that seemed to look right through me. She examined the camera carefully, her expression growing more troubled with each passing moment. "This is no ordinary camera," she said finally. "Where did you say you got it?" I told her about the flea market, about Mrs. Donovan. Dr. Vance nodded, as if confirming something to herself. "There are stories," she began, her voice low, "of objects that can capture more than just light. Some believe that the right combination of materials, crafted with dark intent, can create items capable of revealing the hidden world that exists alongside our own." I shivered, remembering the terrifying figures in my photos. "But why? What's the purpose?" Dr. Vance's eyes met mine right, and I saw genuine fear there. "Power, Mr. Davidson. Knowledge of things beyond our understanding. But it comes at a price. Those who peer too long into the abyss often find the abyss peering back." She went on to explain her theory, that the camera was designed to gradually thin the veil between our world and whatever lay beyond. With each photo taken, the barrier weakened, allowing these entities to push further into our reality. "I would strongly advise you to get rid of that camera, Mr. Davidson," she said. "Destroy it if you can. Objects like that have a way of resisting attempts to be discarded, but you must try." I left her office with my head spinning. Part of me still wanted to believe this was all an elaborate hoax, or maybe I was losing my mind. But deep down, I knew. The camera was a window to something terrible, and I had opened it. That night, I gathered everything I needed. The camera, the photos, the negatives. I drove to an abandoned lot on the outskirts of town, my heart pounding in my chest the entire way. Once there, I soaked everything in lighter fluid and struck a match. The flame flickered to life, and I paused for a split second. Then, steeling myself, I dropped it onto the pile. The fire ignited instantly, flames leaping up to devour the camera and its twisted remnants. I stood frozen, watching in a daze as the leather bubbled and peeled, the metal twisting and warping in the heat. And then, I heard it. A scream, not from outside, but from deep within my own mind. A howl of agony and rage that felt like it was ripping my skull apart. I collapsed to my knees, clutching my head, as visions assaulted me. I saw the figures from the photos no longer confined to film, but vivid and terrifyingly real. I saw the world through their eyes, an endless void of shadows and decay, where humanity was nothing more than prey. And I saw myself through their eyes, a beacon of light in their dark world, a doorway they were determined to keep open. The visions vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving me gasping, sprawled on the ground. The fire had burned itself out, leaving only ash behind. The camera was gone, but as I struggled to my feet, a sinking feeling of dread overtook me. It wasn't over. The world around me looked different. Shadows were deeper, colors more intense. And on the edge of my vision, I could see them, those same entities, watching, waiting. I ran to my car, my panic growing as I drove home, but they followed. I see them everywhere now. In reflections, in the corners of my eyes, sometimes bold enough to appear right in front of me, grinning those horrible grins. I'm writing this as a warning. If you ever come across an old camera, especially a Leica M3 with the serial number 70358, leave it alone. Don't let your curiosity fool you, because once you've glimpsed what's beyond the veil, there's no going back, and they'll never stop watching you. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear the click of a shutter, and I wonder, am I still taking photos, capturing moments of a world I was never meant to witness? Or am I the one being captured now, my soul slowly fading like those terrified figures in the photographs? I don't know if I'll ever escape this curse. All I know is that I must keep running, keep hiding. In this twisted reality I found myself in, I'm no longer the photographer. I'm the subject, and the entities behind the lens are always hungry for more. This story takes me back to when I was still in high school. To fund my video game habit, I regularly tutored an 11-year-old girl. We got along so well that the parents eventually asked me to babysit her and her younger brother a few times. One evening, they were heading downtown for a baseball game followed by drinks with friends, promising to be back before midnight. A typical babysitting gig, right? Wrong. Around 8 p.m., the weather took a drastic turn, and it started raining heavily. We lived in a Gulf city at the time, so storms could roll in quickly and flood the streets just as fast. Once it became clear that a serious storm was heading our way, the parents tried to rush home, but the streets were already flooding, and they ended up getting stuck in a parking lot. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me then, but it certainly is now. The kids' parents called me, and we agreed that I would stay in the guest bedroom while they booked a motel for the night. I got the kids to bed, then settled in the kitchen to do some homework and watch Netflix. After a while, I noticed water starting to seep in under the back doors. The house had several large double doors leading to the back, and I quickly grabbed every towel I could find to wipe up the water and block the door. Once I had cleaned up most of the mess, I returned to the kitchen to continue watching Netflix, thinking there wasn't much else to do. But not 15 minutes later, the power went out and all the lights went off. I was a little freaked out, but I tried to stay calm. That's when the burglar alarm went off in another room. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I was in complete darkness, alone with two young kids, surrounded by flooded roads that no one could drive on. After a moment of blind panic, I realized with horror that I was the closest thing to an adult in the house. I was responsible for those kids. I grabbed the biggest, sharpest kitchen knife I could find and went to check all the doors. They were all still shut, and no one was inside. I called the parents, who explained that the alarm had gone off due to the power cut, and that I just needed to input a code upstairs to turn it off. This happened 3 more times over the next few hours. Once the power came back on, I thought things had settled down, but then we got a tornado warning. I rushed upstairs, got the kids, and we huddled together in a study for about an hour until the warning passed. By this time, it was 2 a.m., and I finally passed out in the guest bedroom. The parents woke me around 7 a.m. when they got home, and I drove home past fallen branches and abandoned, stalled cars. Felt surreal, but thankfully, everything turned out okay, and everyone was safe in the end. This is a true story that happened to me on April 27th in Caracas. At the time, my girlfriend, who is now my wife, and I were staying at my mother-in-law's apartment. We had been there for a few weeks because our apartment, which was my mother's, was under renovation. To give you a bit of context, the apartment was on the 4th floor of a modest 10-story building located directly across from the city's main highway. I call it modest because there are skyscrapers in the city that reach 40 or 50 floors, and people living in those buildings really struggle when the elevators break down. Imagine having to climb 50 or 60 floors on foot. That's a lot of effort. So, there were a lot of things I had to adjust to in that apartment. The sounds were the worst: cars, trucks, motorcycles, flat tires, broken exhausts, and even occasional gunshots from nearby poor neighborhoods, which echoed day and night. In contrast, my mother's neighborhood was very quiet, especially at night. So, I had to adjust my sleeping patterns. I'd often go to bed late, usually around midnight or 1 a.m. This apartment was smaller than the one I was used to, and it was located in a different part of the city, but I didn't mind as long as I could sleep well next to my wife, especially since I struggled with insomnia at times. The first time I visited my wife's apartment, I noticed a small hill with a huge tree and some bushes, plants, and patches of grass right by the highway. At night, it looked a little eerie. On that hill, there was a tiny makeshift aluminum shack. It seemed odd to me, and I thought, that's strange. Maybe someone homeless is living there. I can't imagine anyone choosing to live there. For the first 2 nights, Despite the noise from the highway, I managed to fall asleep after a while. Everything was fine and I slept well. But on the third night, things took a turn. I remember it was late, maybe around midnight or even later. I was nearly asleep, listening to scary stories on my phone to help me drift off, as I usually did. Then suddenly, I was jolted awake by loud, frantic yelling. Someone was shouting a string of curses at someone or something. The noise was so sharp, it instantly startled me. My heart raced and I thought, who or what could that be? I shook my wife gently and asked, "Honey, did you hear that?" She was still almost completely asleep and mumbled, "Hear what? It's nothing, go back to bed." But I could still hear the shouting. I couldn't ignore it, so I decided to check what was happening. I got up, rubbed my eyes, put on my slippers, and quietly walked toward the balcony, where I could see the highway and that small hill clearly. Now, the curses were more distinct, and the voice sounded like a man, possibly out of his mind. I thought to myself, maybe I was right. There's probably someone living in that shack. Standing there, in just my boxers and slippers, I looked out over the dark hill, remembering the small metal hut I had seen the first time I stayed at my wife's place. Strangely, I noticed a flickering campfire and then saw a man emerge from the shack. He was barefoot with long, wild hair and a bushy beard. He was shirtless and wore ragged pants that were falling apart. He stood there in the dark, smoking something, and continued to scream at the highway, cursing loudly for no apparent reason. My mind raced as I wondered what he could be yelling at. Was he shouting at the passing cars, or perhaps the people or dogs far across the highway? I was terrified and couldn't help but think, what on earth is that guy saying? Wasn't he cold? With all the noise, neighborhood dogs started barking in his direction. It struck me as odd that someone would scream so much, especially this late at night. Unfortunately, my mother-in-law, who was a night owl like me, was awake and often slept in the living room. Out of nowhere, she turned on the kitchen light to get some water and then went back to sleep, casting a faint reflection towards the balcony. I quickly turned my head, briefly blinded by the light, but I was also terrified that the man would see me watching him. So I crouched down, hoping he wouldn't notice. But then, I froze in horror as I watched the man approach the campfire and, without hesitation, stomp it out with his bare feet. He turned his gaze away from the highway and looked directly at the outer wall of the building, still yelling curses. I thought, maybe he's just on a bad trip or something. Suddenly, the man looked up at the building. He walked up to the wall and yelled, "I can't take it anymore. The voices are driving me crazy." Then, without warning, he started slamming his head against the wall repeatedly, causing his forehead to bleed as he shouted, "Get out of my head." The sound of his head hitting the wall was absolutely terrifying. After he stopped, he wiped the blood from his forehead with his right hand, looking even more unhinged than before. Out of nowhere, he glanced up and locked eyes with me. "What are you looking at?" he yelled. At that moment, I was paralyzed with fear. I immediately threw myself onto the cold ceramic floor of the balcony, trying to hide. I winced from the chill but stayed there, hoping he wouldn't spot me. The man kept shouting curses in my direction. Terrified, I decided I'd had enough. I quietly crawled back to bed, my heart racing from what I had just witnessed. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, barely able to sleep, listening to my mother-in-law's snores and the man's angry yelling in the distance. The next morning, I felt completely drained from the lack of rest. I told my wife what happened, but she shrugged it off. "Yeah, you get used to him and his yelling," she said. But I could tell she didn't really believe me when I described him slamming his head into the wall, nearly killing himself. That's when it hit me. What if he starts screaming again tonight? Should I call the police? But I knew better. My country's police wouldn't be much help. So, I still don't know what to do about that deranged man. One thing's for sure though, I'll never look out that balcony window at night again. This really happened. I'm a female, and when I was in my 20s, I attended a retreat in the stunning Berkshire Mountains in Massachusetts. The weekend was supposed to be full of lectures and activities designed to help us live our best lives. Little did I know that by midnight, I would be facing my worst nightmare. When we first arrived, we were given a tour of the campus, which included several buildings for lectures and activities, dorms, a cafeteria, and an arcade. We were cautioned about ticks and recent bear sightings, but honestly, I was so captivated by the beauty of the place that I probably didn't pay as much attention as I should have. It was autumn in New England, and the trees were bursting with color. From the edge of the mountain, we could see a babbling brook far below. I had never been so high up, and the view was breathtaking. The best part of the tour was definitely the arcade building. It had all kinds of game rooms, from pool tables to classic arcade games. After we finished touring the arcade, the guide reminded us that we needed to be back in our dorms by 11 p.m. They were very strict about lights out at 11 p.m., with no exceptions. So we had to be in our dorms by then, just a heads up to watch the time. I thought it was a bit strange that there was such a firm curfew for a bunch of adults paying for this retreat, but I figured it was to ensure we got enough rest for the morning's lectures. After dinner, I decided to spend the rest of my first night at the arcade since there were no activities planned. I had my eye on a racing game, the kind where you sit inside and use a steering wheel to stay on the track. I got totally immersed in the game and was having an absolute blast. I couldn't believe it when the lights suddenly went out. The game screen went dark, and so did everything else in the building. Was it really 11 p.m. already? Had I really spent 5 hours on that game? I was frozen in place, terrified. "Is anybody here?" I called out, but there was no answer. Apparently, everyone else had kept track of the time except me. I couldn't blame them for leaving me behind. The arcade was loud, and I was tucked inside the game where no one could see me. Plus, we were all strangers, and no one really knew who was still there. After calling out several more times with no response, I had to face the fact that I was all alone in a pitch-black building. Every single game had turned off as well as every single light, and you could hear a pin drop. Terrified, I decided that the best strategy to avoid getting hurt was to hold my hands out in front of me until I could feel the wall and then slide my hands along until I found the door to the outside. It seemed to take hours to get myself to the wall, never mind to get to the door to the outside. I kept walking into things and getting hurt, but finally, my hand turned a doorknob that was heavier than the rest, and I knew I had finally found the door to go outside. I was so thankful that my nightmare was about to end. As I opened the door, I realized that to my horror, when they said lights out at 11, they not only meant indoor lights, but street lights as well. I was standing outdoors in the pitch darkness on the edge of a mountain, in an area that had recent bear sightings. All around me, as far as the eye could see, was pitch black. I had no idea which was north, south, east, or west. I knew I was on the edge of a cliff because the babbling brook from earlier kept getting louder and louder. So instead of walking with my hands out in front of me like I did in the building, I decided to crawl to make sure I was still on land. I would put one hand lightly in front of me to make sure there was still ground, and then the other would follow, and then my legs. I had to crawl like this for hours, fearing that I would fall off the cliff at any moment. As the brook got louder and louder, fearing that a bear would come and attack me at any moment, wondering if I would ever be able to find my dorm, I was crying in the pitch darkness. I was praying like crazy. I honestly thought I was going to die. I was either going to fall off the mountain or a bear was going to find me, or I was going to tire from this crawling that I had to do, which was exhausting physically and emotionally. About 3 hours later at 3 o'clock in the morning, I finally saw a light in a window. It must be a dorm, I figured. I was going to knock on this window at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I did not care. I just couldn't take this anymore. I stood there scared that the people would be mad that I was disturbing them at 3 o'clock in the morning. But on the other hand, I didn't care because I didn't want to die. A man opened the door and I burst out crying and tried to sob out my story. He took pity on me and gave me a lantern and pointed me in the direction of my dorm. By the time I reached my bed, the sun was coming up and it was almost time to attend the lectures. As you can imagine, all I wanted to do at that point was sleep. I was very thankful to be alive. I I had never babysat for anyone before, so understandably I was a bit anxious. But if I had known what kind of night awaited me, I would have turned down the job in a heartbeat. It didn't help that my parents were so confident that it would be a simple $50 and that the night would fly by. I had a bad feeling from the start, but my dad somehow managed to convince me to push those thoughts aside. Now, looking back, I really wish I had trusted my instincts and stayed away. So, I made my way to the house around 7 p.m., met the parents and the kid, and they went over some basic rules. At first, it seemed like my dad was right. Maybe I was just being dramatic, and if I played my cards right, this could become a regular gig to fund my weekend shopping habits. The parents were friendly, and the kids seemed sweet. So, I relaxed a bit and ended up having a good time, keeping the kid entertained with the help of Disney+, which, let's be honest, I was a fan of. Everything was going smoothly until it was time to put the kid to bed. That's when things started getting awkward. The kid flat out refused, and our once friendly rapport quickly started to fall apart. I felt terrible having to take charge, but he went from crying to shouting and screaming at me, telling me I wasn't his mom, that he hated me, and that I didn't belong there. It actually stung, and I started to realize maybe I wasn't cut out for that kind of responsibility. To be a parent or guardian, you need to be tough enough to enforce the rules, even if it makes you the bad guy. And to anyone thinking that babysitting is an easy way to make a few bucks, trust me, there are far easier ways to earn money that don't make you feel guilty for raising your voice at a kid. Eventually, after what felt like forever, the tantrum seemed to wear the kid out. He still looked upset, but he went to his room, put on his pajamas, and climbed into bed. He asked me to read him a story, and since he had finally listened, I agreed. When his eyes shut and his breathing steadied, I quietly left the room and went downstairs to let him get some rest. About an hour later, I was sitting on the couch, texting a friend to tell them that babysitting was way harder than I had imagined. I was picking at the leftover chicken pot pie my mom had given me to take, catching up on some episodes of The Mandalorian when the house phone rang. Thinking it was the parents checking in, I picked it up, greeting the caller with as much cheer as I could muster. But there was no response on the other end. I said hello a few more times, assumed it was a butt dial or a bad connection, and hung up, heading back to finish my pie. No sooner had I sat back down than the phone rang again. I half expected it, thinking maybe the parents had gone through a tunnel or something. I don't know, but I got up, walked over to the phone, and picked it up again. Only this time, when I do, I can hear breathing on the other end of the phone. I give another cheery hello, but there's just the same breathing coming from the other end. When the person finally speaks, it's this super deep voice, obviously a guy, telling me to check on the sleeping kid. I thought it might have been the kid's dad, but there was also something really weird and distorted about the voice too. I respond like, okay, I'll go check, and the line goes dead immediately. The kid is fine, sleeping like a rock. So as much as I'm kind of creeped out by the weird voice, I figure it must have been the dad. Maybe the parents had argued. I don't know. I tried not to think so much about it. But then, pretty much as soon as I'm back downstairs, the phone rings again. No caller ID. No nothing. So I answer, unable to prevent this fear from entering my voice. Big mistake. Whoever is calling senses this and starts to giggle down the phone line in that same weirdly distorted voice. What they said next made my blood turn to ice. Gonna snatch him up. Gonna snatch up the kitty when you're not looking. Gonna get him. I went silent, just totally silent out of fear. And that's when I heard a creak in the floorboards above me. Someone was moving around in the rooms upstairs. I pretty much dropped the phone and bolt upstairs into the kid's room to find that he's still asleep, or rather, that he very much appears to be asleep. But that same deep, slow breathing isn't there. The more I look, the more like he seems like he's almost hiding his breath or something. Not only that, but his arm is at this weird angle that makes it look like he's holding onto something under his pillow. Something he's trying to hide. In a fury, I pull the pillow up slightly and then realize what's been happening. Whoever thought it was a good idea to buy an 8-year-old kid a phone is straight up crazy. But under that pillow wasn't just a phone, there was a voice disorder under there too. I grab both and run out of the room, back downstairs where the kid starts throwing another temper tantrum. I felt so dumb, completely played by the kid, made to feel terrified and vulnerable. How could someone be so young yet so malicious and mean-spirited? The parents arrived home shortly afterward, and I didn't mention a word of what happened until they had paid me in full. Then I read them the riot act. I was never going to babysit for them again, and they were completely irresponsible, letting their kid have things like a phone, let alone an actual voice disorder. Turns out, the creepy little gadget was their older college-aged kids, and the little guy was fascinated with it and wouldn't give it back. But I didn't care. I wasn't about to put myself out there like that ever again. My father has experienced his fair share of strange and eerie incidents throughout his life, but one particular event stands out to him the most. It occurred back in 1982, when he was 13 and still living in the Philippines. At the time, he was attending Christ the King Missionary Seminary in Quezon City, a Roman Catholic school that trained young men for the priesthood. Of course, my father never followed through with that path, thankfully. He admitted to me that he had never been serious about becoming a priest. Joining the seminary was simply a way for him to gain more independence. Apparently, this story played a role in his decision to reconsider that life. My father, along with his friends John, Rob, Richard, and Nick, all attended the seminary, though none of them went on to become priests. Funny how things work out. The strange events began when Nick fell ill with the flu. Nick was quarantined in the seminary infirmary to prevent the illness from spreading, which was routine at the time. Everyone thought little of it. However, when he returned 2 days later, things took a strange turn. My dad explained that Nick was acting distant and uncharacteristically quiet. Instead of joining in on the laughter and jokes during meals, he would sit in silence, sometimes with his head lowered, other times staring vacantly out the window, avoiding all conversation. Then, one day during lunch, my father and the others noticed something unsettling. Nick was silently crying, tears running down his face, but still refusing to speak or make eye contact with anyone. Worried, my dad and his friends went to one of the seminary regents, a sort of combination of a youth leader and a resident assistant, and explained the situation. Nick was brought into the regent's office, and after some discussion, my dad and the group approached the regent, seeking answers. The regent revealed that, after questioning Nick about his behavior, Nick finally confessed. "There's this man who's been following me, but I didn't want to say anything because I thought no one would believe me." When the regent pressed for more details, Nick described the man as being shirtless, wearing only jeans, and, most disturbingly, having no face. After this chilling revelation, Nick completely lost control, panicking and sobbing uncontrollably. He pleaded with the regent, crying, "I don't want to see him anymore. Please, I don't want to see him. Just help me. Please help me." The regent and the prefect, who was like the principal of the seminary, had to physically restrain Nick as he was overwhelmed with terror. After praying for a while, the regent and others managed to calm Nick down. They reassured him that they would always be there for him if he ever needed help before sending him back. While my father was unsettled by what happened, he initially wondered if Nick's outburst could have been caused by stress or exhaustion. However, it's important to note that the seminarians were well aware of the possibility of encountering ghosts, demons, or other malevolent forces. New students were routinely warned that, because the seminary was meant to reform individuals for God's work, they might face resistance from dark entities trying to hinder their progress. With that in mind, my father and his friends gave Nick space over the next few days, thinking he just needed some time alone to recover. That was until one night when everything escalated. Nick, my father, and their friend Richard all shared dorms with beds positioned close to each other. As they were setting up their mosquito nets and preparing for sleep, a sudden loud shout from Nick startled everyone. He began yelling, "Get away from me!" According to my father, Nick then threw a couple of wild punches as if trying to fight off an invisible attacker. What happened next still leaves my father questioning everything. He watched in shock as Nick's head jerked back, as though struck by an unseen blow, and then his entire body was violently thrown into the air. My father, who was fairly skeptical despite being somewhat religious, said that Nick's body was thrown back in such a way that it looked too real. There was no way his knees could have buckled to explain it as a simple jump. If it was all just a figment of their imagination, my dad joked, then Nick was a phenomenal actor. But the night only became more bizarre. After Nick was struck by the invisible force, he lost consciousness, and the regent was immediately called. The prefect and a priest soon joined, and together they carried Nick to the regent's office. As shaken as my father was, he, along with John and Rob, followed them, partially out of concern, but mostly due to curiosity, despite the fear gnawing at them. Once inside the regent's office, my father began regretting his decision to stick around. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension, and even the priest's face showed signs of anxiety and reluctance about dealing with what might be a demonic presence. The regent, prefect, and priest assumed that my father and the others would stay to help pray for Nick and aid in his recovery. They quickly got to work, starting the rosary, their voices steady despite the mounting dread. But just as the night couldn't get any more unsettling, something even stranger happened. Halfway through praying the Hail Mary, my father's friend John suddenly began speaking in gibberish, what my father could only describe as speaking in tongues. John then collapsed, and fortunately, the priest reacted swiftly, catching him and gently lowering him to the floor to prevent him from injuring himself. At this point, my father was beyond confused and terrified, wishing he'd never set foot in the seminary and could instead be at home, watching Three's Company with his dad. The fear was overwhelming, and all they could do was keep praying, hoping the situation would improve. Not long after, John regained consciousness, acting as if nothing had happened, though he was clearly disoriented. My father asked him what caused him to speak like that, but John just repeatedly responded with, "I don't know." The group continued praying, but Nick remained unconscious. Once they finished praying, the regent, the prefect, and the priest decided the best course of action was to let the boys return to their dorms to get some rest. They assured the group that Nick would stay in the office overnight, likely to keep watch over him, pray for him, and maybe even contact medical authorities. The boys reluctantly left and headed back to their dorm, where the other students were also shaken and unable to sleep after the strange turn of events. My dad's friend, Reggie, whose bed was beside his, timidly asked if they could share a bed since he was too scared to be alone. My father agreed. He remembers shaking so badly from fear that the bed frame rattled, a detail that he finds somewhat humorous now, though it certainly wasn't funny at the time. The next morning, Nick's parents arrived to pick him up for a 2-week leave. When he returned after those 2 weeks, he was completely back to normal, and no one ever mentioned that strange night again. A while later, after my father and his friends had left the seminary, Nick had a falling out with some people over personal issues, and my dad lost contact with him. John, however, remained a close family friend, and my father occasionally brings up the story with him. While he's considered that it might have been extreme anxiety or paranoia, none of those explanations really seem to fit. To this day, my father can't explain what happened. He wonders if Nick's flu could have caused hallucinations, but the way he describes that night, the feeling of being punched, thrown into the air, or whatever it was, still haunts him. It's something he can't fully wrap his head around. Several years ago, I traveled to Nepal with my sister, M, and 2 of her high school friends, V and N. Our goal was to escape the chaos of city life and dive into the peaceful, mystical charm of the Himalayan mountains. We planned to enjoy the local culture and hike one of the many breathtaking trails. Unfortunately, due to circumstances beyond our control, we ended up going during the monsoon season. This meant intense heat, humidity, and almost constant rainfall. As you can imagine, the hiking paths were nearly deserted, with few tourists around. The dense, soaking clouds blocked what little light there was, and the thick fog often made it hard to see. Still, we had a fantastic time. The trek itself could be a story on its own, though much lighter in tone, especially when V found herself attacked by a swarm of bloodthirsty leeches summoned by the rain. Our adventures were filled with mishaps, getting tangled in mischief and nearly getting knocked out cold after some unfortunate flirting with a farmer's wife. But despite the bruises and scratches, We finally completed the trek and returned to the capital. Our flight home was the following morning, so we had just one day left to explore Kathmandu. Kathmandu is a city that divides people. Its winding streets and cluttered alleys are filled with a mix of vibrant culture and overwhelming stimuli. Trying to navigate the city on your own, particularly at night, is a daunting challenge. The pollution in the air and the constant traffic only make things worse. Among us, the only one who truly enjoyed the city was Vi, who had a deep fascination with all things South Asian and was completely enchanted by the temples. So, despite our exhausted bodies, still recovering from the 2-week trek, we followed her, dragging ourselves from one site to the next as she lectured us on spirituality and the search for meaning. By the time we finished our last stop, the monkey temple, night had already started to fall. We kept looking over our shoulders, wary of the sneaky monkeys that roamed the area, always looking for an opportunity to snatch food or whatever else they could get their hands on. One of the cheeky creatures even swiped my glasses. As we made our way back into the city, things took a turn for the worse. We heard thunder rumbling in the distance. The clouds, which had been slowly creeping in, began to swell and change color from deep purple to black, crackling with lightning. Then, the rain began to pour, heavy and relentless. We scrambled for shelter, wading through rain-filled ditches and darting down narrow alleyways. Finally, we ducked under a tin roof beside the road, our soaked clothes sticking to our skin. Just as we were catching our breath, a blur of movement caught my eye. Em had darted into the road, waving her arms. She was always the impulsive one, quick to act without hesitation. Spotting faint headlights in the distance, barely visible through the downpour, she took a chance and, luckily, it turned out to be a taxi. We rushed into the Suzuki with a collective sigh of relief. The cramped space barely fit our bags, but the thought of finally being out of the rain made the tight squeeze worth it. The driver, with his scruffy hair and unsettlingly calm, deliberate voice, turned around in the near-total darkness of the taxi. Flashing us a wide, toothy grin, he asked, "Where to?" We exchanged a brief look of confusion, realizing we hadn't really planned for this last day in Kathmandu. Completely unfamiliar with the city, we had no idea where to go. The driver, sensing our hesitation, quickly suggested taking us to a cousin's hostel, claiming it was a great place. Tired and without any other options, we reluctantly agreed. With a hint of satisfaction on his face, he assured us we'd love it there and even promised that the first round of drinks would be on him. As the car sped through the rain-soaked streets, we tried to make small talk with the driver, but the steady drumming of the rain on the roof soon lulled us into a daze. I gazed out the window at the blurred figures and objects, their outlines distorting in the misty rain, and before I knew it, I had fallen asleep. When I woke, I realized we were still in the taxi, and everyone else had dozed off as well. Through my grogginess and the poor visibility, I noticed we were definitely no longer in the same area of the city. The streets were pitch dark, with barely any street lights, and all I could make out were the jagged shapes of poles and looming concrete structures. There were no people in sight, and a sense of unease began to creep over me. How long had we been driving? Where was this driver taking us? What had calmed my suspicions before was the general kindness and hospitality of the Nepali people we'd encountered, which, along with the supposed safety of the country, had made us feel secure, maybe too secure. It hadn't crossed our minds that our trust could easily be taken advantage of. The driver noticed I was awake and flashed his toothy grin at me, telling me it was good timing and that I should wake the others. As I stepped out of the car onto a muddy, empty street, that uneasy feeling returned in full force. It was clear that the others were starting to share the same discomfort as we took in our surroundings. The so-called cousin's hostel was nothing like what we'd imagined. Mold-specked walls and peeling paint surrounded a house that, though concealed by the rain and darkness, was unmistakably in a state of decay. It wasn't much worse than the rest of Kathmandu's post-earthquake structures, but it had an eerie, run-down atmosphere that made it impossible to feel comfortable. We were definitely not staying there. Just as one of us was about to protest, the driver enthusiastically bounded around, gesturing for us to follow him through a rusty open gate leading into the yard. We only followed him to get out of the rain, which had started to flood the alleyways, carrying with it refuse and debris. Upon entering, we were met with a horrifying scene illuminated by a single dim bulb hanging from a tarp that covered most of the yard. The air was thick with a nauseating stench that made my eyes water, and the whole place felt revolting. The ground was littered with waste, the walls smeared with dirt, and a single plastic table was covered in unspeakable filth. The sight of it all left us filled with disgust and dread, replacing any lingering unease we had before. And I kid you not, there were needles scattered all over the place. It was at that moment we all knew we had to get out of there, but it wasn't until we turned to look at the driver under the dim light that the full gravity of our situation hit us. This man looked like he had just crawled out of a nightmare. His sunken, bloodshot eyes stared at us from a face covered in angry sores and cuts. His toothy grin now revealed decayed, cracked teeth, and we were clearly standing in the middle of a drug addict's lair. Couldn't believe it. Holy shit, V, how did you not notice? You were sitting right next to him. I didn't know what to do at this point. He just stood there, blocking the gate, glaring at us. He wasn't much of a physical threat. After all, there were 4 of us and one frail, drugged-out meth head. Well, 3 of us, at least. V had always been easily scared, and as I glanced at her, I saw she was visibly shaking. If things turned south, she'd be no help at all. A, despite his loud boasting, would be the first to bail if things got heated. I was starting to get really anxious now. What if he had a weapon? Maybe a used syringe or something he'd use to lash out at us. The last thing I wanted was for any of us to get something from him, and my mind was racing with worst-case scenarios. How were we going to get out of here? I was certain there wasn't a taxi for miles, and it dawned on me that I had no idea where we even were. Our phones were completely useless with our local numbers. I cursed myself for being so carelessly unaware. As anxiety started to swallow me whole, Em spoke up. She was the one who kept her head cool when everything else was spiraling. She managed to give us some hope, stepping up as the calm leader we needed. She addressed the driver in a calm, measured tone, telling him we'd forgotten something and had to rush back into town. We offered to pay him double the fare, but he wasn't interested. With wild gestures and an irate tone, he started speaking in rapid bursts, but we barely understood him through his frantic words. He was insisting that it would be impossible to drive back in these conditions and that our best option was to wait it out at the bar. He repeated that the first round was on him, as if that would somehow make us feel better. He pointed toward the house, and that's when we noticed it. Inside, everything was dark. The wide, doorless entrance loomed like a menacing invitation to nothingness, threatening to swallow anyone who dared step closer. He urged us to follow him inside for the drinks, waving his hand like we were running out of time. His insistence started to get under my skin, and I felt the urge to snap at him. But before I could react, Em stepped in. She remained calm and firm, telling him that we had no time to waste and, if he wasn't able to drive, he should help us contact another taxi. It seemed like he either didn't understand or simply didn't care, because he continued pushing us to come inside. Quickly escalated. He kept repeating himself, his voice growing more insistent, his eyes clouding over into a sickly gray. The flesh around his mouth looked sunken and his posture was tense, like he was forcing himself not to lunge at us. His hands were trembling, and I knew that if it came down to it, I wouldn't hesitate to knock him over like a sack of laundry if he made any sudden moves. V, clearly fed up, blurted out, "Fuck this. Let's just leave." At that, he went completely still, almost as if he didn't know how to handle our decision to walk away. He turned to look at the house, then back at us, and with a hiss, he muttered, "Okay, I get phone," he added, and without another word, he scurried off toward the entrance, vanishing into the darkness. We all exchanged looks, a brief silence hanging in the air, the only sound the rain pelting against the tarp above us and the distant rumble of thunder. V spoke again, her voice tinged with panic this time. "Fuck this. This isn't normal," she added, her voice shaky. "We need to leave now." I tried to stay composed, replying, "And go where? You saw for yourself. There's no one out there, and it's pouring rain. Though I was trying to stay rational, I knew we all felt the same overwhelming dread. M, who always kept a cool head, seemed as unnerved as the rest of us. I was fidgeting now, his fear palpable. I too felt a deep unease. Then we heard it. A faint rustling from inside the house, followed by crackling and the unmistakable sound of whispering. My heart began to pound in my chest, thudding like a drum. I felt like my legs had turned to jelly, and none of us dared to move, completely frozen in fear. The whispering continued, faint but unmistakable through the pounding rain, enough to make my skin crawl. My eyes locked onto the dark entrance of the house as I slowly began to back away, the others following my lead. Just as we turned to leave, it happened. The heavy sound of footsteps charging towards us, the unmistakable thud of a stampede coming from within. Without thinking, we bolted, sprinting through the gate and out into the street. From the corner of my eye, I saw 4 figures closing in on us, with another one emerging from the house. They started shouting and shrieking at us as we ran, desperately turning onto a side road. I felt something was past me, and when I glanced back, I saw that one of them had thrown something. Luckily, it landed with a sickening thud just behind me. We kept running blindly, corner after corner, knowing a single misstep could cost us our lives. V was falling behind, gasping for breath, struggling to keep up. But the shouting was starting to fade, and with every step, the sounds grew fainter. We didn't stop to catch our breath or regroup, just blindly following M's lead through narrow roads and alleys. At one point, I thought my heart might explode from the pressure, but just when I felt like I couldn't go any further, we saw it, headlights in the distance. It was like a beacon of hope, and we ran towards it, like lunatics, slamming our hands on the windows and screaming for help. The elderly driver, who had no reason to stop, surprisingly decided to help. We piled into the car, gasping for air, and immediately told him to drive, to get us out of there as fast as possible. It took us a good while to calm down. V was completely hysterical, and A was shaking uncontrollably. Even once we were in the safety of the car, the fear wouldn't leave us. It clung to us, following us all the way to the airport the next morning, even as we boarded the plane out of Nepal. In the end, we didn't go to the police. We didn't have any proof, and even if we did, there was no way to find that house again. Our backpacks were lost, but thankfully, M had the foresight to keep her passport in her waist pack, which spared us a lot of trouble. Even now, I still feel that cold, creeping fear whenever I think about that house, that dark entrance, and the murderers lying in wait, ready to ambush us. When I was 21, I made the poor decision to move out of my parents' house before I could really afford a place on my own. It was something I had been planning for months, scouring listings for cheap apartments, roommates, or anything that could help me get out. For some reason, I prioritized moving out over everything else, even if it wasn't the best timing. After months of searching, I found a post on Facebook about a room for rent nearby. It was in a 2-bedroom house, and the owner was renting out the 2nd bedroom. I sent him a message, and within minutes, he responded. He asked a few questions and then sent over a document, basically a long list of rules for moving in. It seemed like common sense stuff, so I agreed to all of them. He invited me to come by and look at the room that same day. When I arrived, I was really surprised by how clean and well-kept the house was. It looked like something out of a magazine, perfectly decorated and furnished. The owner, Terry, was a bit odd, though. He was in his late 20s, but his appearance and personality didn't match the way the house looked. He was wearing a dirty t-shirt and had this strange way of talking. Still, I was so focused on the idea of moving out that I didn't even care. A week later, I packed up a rental van with my things and drove to the house. But when I walked inside, it almost felt like I had stepped into the wrong place. The house was completely empty. There were no decorations or furniture, except for an old couch in the living room. It looked nothing like the place I had seen earlier. Terry was there and acted like nothing was unusual, excitedly talking about how happy he was to have a roommate. I asked about all the missing furniture, but he basically brushed off my question and just started helping me move my stuff in. I was definitely a bit weirded out, but I still went ahead with moving in. Over the next few weeks, I rarely saw Terry. He was always working and didn't get home until late at night. About a month in, I started noticing that Terry wasn't coming home most nights. Maybe once a week. I'd hear him get home around 2 or 3 a.m. He'd hang around downstairs for a while, then leave, not returning for another week or so. Part of me didn't care since I had the house to myself, but another part of me was curious about what he was doing. He had been so eager to have me move in, but now he was hardly ever there. Then one night, around 2 a.m., several weeks since I'd last seen him, I was woken up by Terry banging on my bedroom door, yelling my name. I quickly got up and rushed to the door. There he was, standing in the doorway, sweat dripping down his face, and a look of anger in his eyes. "Do not leave your room," he said in a harsh voice, then grabbed the door and ripped the handle out of my hands, slamming it shut. I stood there in shock, listening to him walk downstairs. I opened the door quietly, and after a few seconds, I heard the sound of him dragging something heavy across the floor and into the garage. I ran downstairs to see what was going on. There was a smear of mud and dirt going across the kitchen and leading up to the garage door. I tried to open it, but he'd somehow locked it from inside. I realized it was best to just remove myself from the situation and ran out to my car, driving away while calling the cops. When they got to the house, Terry was already gone and the smears on the floor had been cleaned up. After some days of investigating, it turned out that Terry was actually renting the house from someone else. So I wasn't even allowed to have legally moved in, and all the documents he sent me and had me sign were fake. Terry likely wasn't his real name either, and as far as I know, he never showed back up after that. I don't know for sure what he was up to, but he was so adamant about me staying in my room that night, and with him vanishing afterward, he clearly had something horrible he was hiding. But what really confuses me is why he wanted me to move into the house and live with him so badly. I can't help but think that he had some sort of plans for me, and I barely got out of there without having to find out the hard way. I never thought I'd be thankful for a broken coffee maker, but that malfunctioning appliance saved my life. If it hadn't forced me into that little cafe on 3rd Street, I might have never escaped the man who nearly destroyed me. My name is Emily, and this is the story of how I fell for a monster and how I clawed my way back to freedom. It started on a Tuesday. My old coffee maker had finally packed it in, sputtering out its last bitter drops before dying with an ominous electrical scent. Caffeine deprived and irritable, I ducked into the first cafe I saw on my way to work. That's where I met Mark. He was ahead of me in line, tall, broad-shouldered, and with a smile that lit up his entire face. When the barista called out his order, a vanilla latte, he turned and caught me staring. "Sweet tooth," he said, giving me a wink while holding up his drink. "My guilty pleasure," I replied, laughing despite myself. "No judgment here. I'm about to order the sugariest thing on the menu." We started chatting, and before I knew it, he had convinced me to sit with him for a few minutes. Those few minutes turned into an hour, and I ended up being late for work, but I didn't care. Mark was funny, smart, and so attentive that it made me feel like the most interesting person in the world. As I finally rushed out, already brainstorming how to explain my tardiness to my boss, Mark caught my hand. "Can I see you again?" he asked, those blue eyes sparkling with hope. I didn't hesitate. Absolutely. Looking back, I wonder if things would have been different if I'd said no. If I'd just gotten my coffee and gone to work like any other day. But I can't change the past. I can only learn from it. Our first date was perfect. Mark took me to a quaint Italian restaurant tucked away on a side street I'd never noticed before. He ordered wine, pulled out my chair, and listened intently to every word I said. By the time dessert arrived, I was already half in love. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Mark was attentive, calling and texting regularly. He surprised me with flowers at work, planned romantic picnics, and always seemed to know exactly what to say to make me smile. My friends were thrilled for me. "He sounds amazing. My best friend, Sarah," gushed over brunch. You deserve this, she added, trailing off. But I knew exactly what she meant. My ex, Jake, had been a nightmare. Controlling, jealous, and eventually abusive. It had taken me months to break free from that relationship. Mark was like a breath of fresh air after being underwater for so long. Or so I thought. The first red flag was so small I almost missed it. We were out at a bar with some of Mark's friends, and I was chatting with one of the guys about a book we'd both read. Mark came over and slid his arm around my waist. His grip was a little too tight, his smile a little too forced. Having fun? He asked, his eyes colder than I'd ever seen them. Later that night, he exploded. What the hell was that? He demanded as soon as we were alone. Flirting with Tom right in front of me? I was stunned. Flirting? Mark, we were just talking about a book. But he wouldn't hear it. He ranted for what felt like hours, accusing me of disrespecting him, of trying to make him jealous. By the end of it, I was in tears, apologizing for something I hadn't even done. The next morning, he was all apologies. I'm so sorry, baby, he said, bringing me breakfast in bed. I don't know what came over me. I just care about you so much. The thought of losing you scares me. I forgave him, of course. After all, everyone has bad moments, right? But that was just the beginning. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Mark began to change, or maybe the mask just started to slip. He wanted to know where I was all the time, who I was with, what I was wearing. He'd show up unannounced at my workplace, claiming he just wanted to surprise me. He insisted I share my phone's location with him for safety. My world began to shrink. I saw my friends less and less. Mark always had a reason why we couldn't go out, why we should stay in just the two of us. When I did see them, he'd blow up my phone with texts and calls. I just miss you, he'd say when I confronted him about it. Is it so wrong to want to talk to my girlfriend? I started to doubt myself. Maybe I was being too sensitive. Maybe this was just what love looked like. Then came the night that changed everything. We were at his place having dinner. I mentioned that a coworker had invited me to a concert that weekend. Mark's face darkened. Who's this coworker? He demanded. Just a friend, I said, my stomach already knotting with anxiety. His name's Alex. He had an extra ticket and I didn't get to finish. Mark's fist came down on the table so hard that glasses toppled over, spilling red wine across the white tablecloth like blood. His Mark roared, "You're going out with another man?" "It's not like that," I protested, my voice small. "It's just a concert. There'll be a whole group of us." But Mark was beyond reason. He advanced on me, his face twisted with rage. For the first time, I was truly afraid of him. "You're not going," he snarled. "You're mine, Emily. Do you understand? Mine." He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in painfully. I cried out, trying to pull away, but his grip was like iron. "Mark, you're hurting me." Something in my voice must have gotten through to him. He let go abruptly, stumbling back. Horror flashed across his face, quickly replaced by remorse. "Oh God, Emily, I'm so sorry," he stammered. "I didn't mean to. I would never hurt you. You know that, right?" But I did know. In that moment, I saw Mark clearly for the first time. This wasn't love. This was control, manipulation, abuse, and it would only get worse. "I have to go," I said, grabbing my purse with shaking hands. Mark tried to stop me, alternating between apologies and accusations, but I pushed past him. I ran out of his apartment, down the stairs, and into the cool night air. I didn't stop running until I reached Sarah's apartment. She opened the door, took one look at my tear-stained face, and pulled me into a hug. "Oh, Em," she whispered. "What did he do?" That night, as I poured out the whole story to Sarah, I felt the fog lifting. How had I not seen it before? The isolation, the jealousy, the control, it was Jake all over again, just in a different package. "You can't go back," Sarah said firmly. "He's dangerous, Em." I knew she was right, but I also knew it wouldn't be that easy. The next few weeks were hell. Mark called and texted constantly. He showed up at my work, my apartment, even Sarah's place. Each time, he swung between desperate pleas for forgiveness and veiled threats. "You'll never find anyone who loves you like I do," he'd say. "You're making a big mistake. You'll regret this." I changed my number, my email, even moved to a new apartment. But still, he found ways to reach me. It all came to a head one rainy night. I was walking home from the subway when I saw him. Mark was leaning against my building. His eyes locked on me. My blood ran cold. "Emily," he called out, his voice deceptively gentle. "We need to talk." I turned and ran. I could hear his footsteps behind me, getting closer. Rain lashed at my face as I sprinted down the street, my heart pounding in my ears. I ducked into an all-night diner, breathless and soaked. The waitress took one look at my face and ushered me to a booth in the back. "You okay, honey?" she asked, concern etched on her weathered face. I shook my head, tears mixing with raindrops on my cheeks. "There's a man. He's following me. He won't leave me alone." Understanding dawned in her eyes. She nodded once, then turned to the cook. "Call the cops and Joe. We've got a situation." When the police arrived, I told them everything. About the emotional abuse, the control, the stalking. They took my statement, promised to pick Mark up for questioning. As I sat there, wrapped in the blanket the kind waitress had given me, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. The road to recovery wasn't easy. There were restraining orders, court dates, and countless therapy sessions. There were nights when I woke up in a cold sweat, sure I'd heard Mark's voice, days when I jumped at every shadow, convinced he was lurking just around the corner. But slowly, surely, I began to heal. I reconnected with friends, threw myself into my work, and started rediscovering who I was without the constant weight of Mark's presence. Now, sitting in that same cafe where it all began, I can't help but reflect on how far I've come. The Emily who met Mark that day feels like a stranger to me now. She was looking for love in all the wrong places, willing to accept scraps of affection and call it a feast. But the Emily writing this now, she knows her worth. She knows that real love doesn't shrink you, it helps you grow. Real love is supportive, not suffocating. Real love is a partnership, not a possession. I'm not ready to date again, not yet. But when I am, I'll be going in with my eyes wide open. Because while my experience with Mark was traumatic, it taught me invaluable lessons about red flags, trusting my instincts, and, most importantly, about the strength I have within me. So if you're reading this and see yourself in my story, know this: you're stronger than you think. You deserve better, and there is a way out. As for me, I'm ordering my coffee with extra sugar, just because I can, and looking forward to whatever the future holds. Because for the first time in a long time, that future is entirely my own. The moment I saw his thumb jutting out from the side of the desolate highway, I knew I shouldn't stop. But as the lone figure grew larger in my rearview mirror, curiosity got the best of me. I had no idea that this decision would thrust me into a nightmare that would haunt me for years. The sun was setting over the vast expanse of the Mojave Desert, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. I'd been driving for hours, the endless stretch of road broken only by the occasional tumbleweed or distant mountain range. My eyes were heavy, my back sore from too many hours at the wheel. I was longing to reach the next town, wherever it might be, and finally get some rest. Then I saw him, a lone figure standing by the side of the road, his arm outstretched, thumb raised in that universal sign of a hitchhiker. As I got closer, more details emerged. He appeared to be in his mid-30s, with a scruffy beard and clothes that looked worn and ragged. A large backpack sat at his feet. Every instinct screamed at me to keep driving. I'd heard all the warnings about the dangers of picking up strangers, especially out here in the middle of nowhere. But something about the man's posture, the slump of his shoulders, made me hesitate. He looked defeated, desperate. Before I could talk myself out of it, I was slowing down, pulling off onto the shoulder a few yards ahead of him. I watched in my side mirror as he jogged toward the car, his face lighting up with a relieved smile. "Thank you," he said as he opened the passenger door. "I didn't think anyone would stop." I nodded, trying to ignore the unease bubbling in my stomach. "Where are you headed?" Just as far as you're willing to take me, he replied, settling into the seat. I'm Jim, by the way. Alex, I said, pulling back onto the highway. Nice to meet you, Jim. For the first hour or so, everything seemed fine. Jim was quiet but polite, answering my occasional questions with short responses. He was from back east, he said, trying to make his way to California for a fresh start. I found myself relaxing, thinking maybe I'd been paranoid earlier. As night fell and the desert grew dark around us, Jim began to get more talkative. He asked about me, where I was from, where I was going. I gave him vague answers, still not entirely comfortable with sharing too much personal information. You ever wonder what it would be like to just disappear? Jim asked suddenly, his voice taking on a strange edge. To leave everything behind and become someone else entirely. I glanced at him, a chill running down my spine despite the warm night air. Can't say I have, I replied cautiously. Jim chuckled, but there was no humor in it. I have a lot, lately. The conversation lulled after that, an uncomfortable silence filling the car. I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, my eyes flicking more frequently to the rear-view mirror. The road behind us was empty, stretching into darkness. Mind if I changed the radio station? Jim asked after a while. Go ahead, I said, grateful for the break in tension. As he leaned forward to fiddle with the dial, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Tucked into the waistband of his jeans, partially hidden by his shirt, was the unmistakable shape of a gun. My mind raced. What had I gotten myself into? Was he a criminal on the run? Was he planning to rob me, or worse? I tried to keep my voice steady as I spoke. So, Jim, where exactly in California are you headed? He turned to me, his eyes narrowing slightly. I thought I said I didn't have a specific destination. Right, sorry. I mumbled, cursing myself for the slip-up. I must have misheard. Jim was watching me now, his earlier friendliness replaced by something harder, more calculating. I could feel sweat beating on my forehead, my heart pounding in my chest. You seem nervous, Alex, he said, his voice low. Everything okay? I nodded, perhaps a bit too enthusiastically. Yeah, fine. Just tired, I guess. Been driving a long time. Maybe we should pull over, Jim suggested. Take a break. No, I said quickly, then tried to recover. I'm okay. There's a town coming up soon, I think. We can stop there. Jim didn't respond, but I could feel his eyes on me. The silence in the car was oppressive, broken only by the engine and the occasional static from the radio. I was trying to figure out what to do when I saw it. A sign for a rest stop, just a mile ahead. It wasn't ideal, but it was something. Maybe I could find a way to get help, or at least get away from Jim. I'm gonna pull into this rest stop, I announced, trying to sound casual. Need to use the restroom. Jim nodded slowly. All right. I pulled into the rest stop, my mind whirling with half-formed plans. There were a few other cars parked there, which gave me a small measure of comfort. As soon as I stopped the car, I unbuckled my seatbelt and reached for the door handle. Alex, Jim said, his voice stopping me cold. I wouldn't do that if I were you. I turned to find the gun in his hand, pointed directly at me. My heart felt like it might burst out of my chest. Jim, I said, my voice shaking. You don't have to do this, whatever you're running from. Shut up, he snapped. Start the car. We're leaving. Please, I begged. Just take the car. You don't need me. His laugh was cold, humorless. Oh, but I do. See, you're my insurance policy. As long as I have you, no one's going to look too closely at me. We're just two friends on a road trip, right? With trembling hands, I started the car. As we pulled out of the rest stop, I saw a family returning to their minivan. I wanted to scream, to honk the horn, to do something to get their attention, but the cold press of the gun against my ribs kept me silent. We drove through the night, Jim directing me onto smaller and smaller roads. I lost track of where we were, each mile taking us further from safety, further from any hope of rescue. As dawn began to break, Jim instructed me to pull onto a dirt road that led into the desert. We bumped along for what felt like hours, until finally, he told me to stop. End of the line, Alex, he said, gesturing for me to get out of the car. On shaky legs, I stepped out into the desert. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. Jim walked me a short distance from the car, the gun never wavering. "I'm sorry it had to be this way," he said, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of regret in his eyes. "You seem like a good guy. Wrong place, wrong time, I guess." I closed my eyes, waiting for the shot that would end it all. But it never came. Instead, all I heard was the sound of retreating footsteps, followed by the sharp slam of a car door. I opened my eyes just in time to see my car speeding away, kicking up a cloud of dust. Jim was gone, leaving me stranded in the middle of the desert with nothing but the clothes on my back. Took 2 days for someone to find me. 2 days of scorching heat, freezing nights, thirst, hunger, and the ever-growing fear that I might not make it out alive. When a park ranger finally spotted me, I was delirious, sunburned, and barely holding on. The police never found Jim or my car. They told me I was lucky to be alive, that many people in similar situations weren't so fortunate. But as I lay in the hospital, trying to piece together what had happened, I didn't feel lucky. I felt violated, betrayed by my own kindness. It's been years since that night, but I still see Jim's face in my dreams. I still feel the cold press of that gun against my ribs. And every time I see a hitchhiker on the side of the road, I'm filled with a mix of fear and guilt as I speed past, windows locked, eyes straight ahead. I learned a hard lesson in the desert that day. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who look just like us, the ones who prey on our compassion, our willingness to help. And sometimes, choosing to help a stranger can lead us down a road from which there's no turning back. When I was around 6 years old, in 2004, my mom began taking my sister and me to Dr. Daniel's pediatric dental office. It was located inside a massive yellow mansion, which also happened to be his home. The place was truly beautiful. At that time, I was an incredibly shy child, suffering from selective mutism and exhibiting traits similar to autism. As you can imagine, I was very dependent on my mom for reassurance and needed someone to help me communicate, as interacting with strangers, especially men, was incredibly stressful for me. When our names were called from the waiting room, my mom followed us into the office. Dr. Daniels quickly told her that parents were not allowed to stay with their children because it encouraged independence, and my mom, though hesitant, agreed. Once inside, Dr. Daniels immediately separated my sister and me, which made me feel even more scared. I couldn't help but cry, and seeing this, Dr. Daniels became upset. He forcefully covered my mouth and nose, shaking me while threatening that if I didn't stop crying and disturbing the other kids, things would get much worse for me. Naturally, this only intensified my fear, and I began crying even harder. Dr. Daniels then took me into his house, which was part of the office, and yelled at me again. He grabbed me by the neck and shoved me. His hygienist, Judy, came over and coldly told me that if I kept crying, she'd spank me so hard I wouldn't know what hit me. Afterward, Dr. Daniels gave me a strange juice and left me alone in his house for several minutes before returning me to the dental chair and performing work on my teeth. I remember somehow knowing that if I didn't act tough and hold back my tears, things would only get worse, so I forced myself to stay calm. All I wanted was to be with my mom. After our first appointment, my sister and I told our mom how scared we were of Dr. Daniels and how cruel he seemed, but she brushed it off, attributing it to my anxiety, so we kept going back. Every visit felt just as terrifying. Whenever we pulled up to the mansion, my heart sank. The place, once beautiful, now seemed terrifying to me. Dr. Daniels, or the Tooth Man as he liked to call himself, always had us undergo extensive procedures. He performed sealants on many of our baby teeth and removed several others, often without any regard for the pain. During many of these procedures, we had to keep our mouths open with a retractor. He would leave us like that for nearly 45 minutes before coming to work on our teeth. Sometimes, he'd eat lunch while we were left in agony with our mouths open. One of the worst kinds of pain I've ever experienced. I remember one particular time in third grade, I'd been lying in the chair with the retractor in for over an hour. The pain became unbearable, and I tried to scream and cry. Dr. Daniels rushed over, furious, removed the retractor, and took me back to his house, where he scolded me for being a big baby and disturbing the other kids. I felt so miserable for having cried, especially after managing to hold back my tears for so long. He then took me back to the dental chair and then pinned me down to my seat in a straitjacket. He put my retractors back on and said that I would have to wait longer because I caused such a scene. All I could do was shed silent tears and drool everywhere, and I couldn't even wipe it because he locked up my arms. Afterwards, my mouth would become so swollen and filled with rashes. It hurt to talk for days. It would leave bruises and swells as soon as I left his chair. He would often tell my mother I was a difficult patient if I so much as winced at his torture. Once he removed 6 of my teeth at once and I could barely eat. While he ripped out teeth, he would often sing songs. It reminded me of almost Sweeney Todd. When I was in 7th grade, I started getting some new braces and we started seeing an orthodontist. Not long after that, we stopped seeing Dr. Dan and started seeing a new dentist who was actually nice. I'd never known that getting your teeth cleaned didn't have to feel like going through a saw trap. I think my mom took us out of Dr. Dan's practice when the orthodontist looked at our dental records and saw a lot of unnecessary procedures being done on our mouths. Not long ago, I was having a conversation with a friend about our childhood fears, and instantly my mind went to the tooth man. Curious, I Googled him to see what had happened to him, and to my happiness, the practice was shut down. Also left under his name was a Yelp page that is still left up. The page was filled with numerous 1-star reviews from former patients that were once abused as kids in his office, using the page as an outlet to express their trauma. I started to cry because their experiences were so close and some identical to what I went through when I was a kid. It was so sad, but at the same time really validating to know that I was not alone. A lot of the procedures we went through were just a scam for him to collect money off of our parents' insurance. And now that I think about it, he probably was so adamant on us not crying and screaming for help because he didn't want parents to hear and come and see what was going on. I shake thinking about this. I really pray that he hasn't opened up another practice somewhere else. I know it's hard not to blame parents in this situation, but the truth is this man was a swift abuser. For every bruise and swell we had, he would have dental explanations that would make the parents feel stupid for asking. He was an authority figure. I don't blame my mom for not believing us. She knew he was firm, but probably thought we were confusing firmness with meanness. To be honest, even writing this, the torture was so wild it actually sounds made up. She eventually did come around. She's not alone, as there were 100 and 100 of patients that were duped and deceived by him. This took place over the course of about a year when I was 15 to 16, and I'm 20 now. It's only recently that I've come to realize how messed up everything was. At the time, I was still living at home, but my older sister, who's 7 years older than me, had already moved out. She was living with her now husband, their high school best friend, and a guy they'd met through one of those roommate finding websites. This guy, who we'll call WR for Weird Roommate, was a bit of a recluse. The stereotypical nerd who preferred to stay holed up in his room watching Star Trek and playing computer games rather than socializing with the others. The only person he ever seemed to want to be around was his girlfriend, who we'll call WGF. She was just as shy and nerdy as he was. At the time, WR was 28 and WGF was 24. They were both a little odd, but at first they didn't seem harmful. For simplicity's sake, I'll refer to the friendly roommate as FR, the weird roommate as WR, and his odd girlfriend as WGF. My sister and I never really had the best relationship with our parents, and things were especially strained at this point. Our mother was in a relationship with a man who, to put it mildly, was an abusive and awful person who couldn't stand me and would find any excuse to yell at me. Because of that, I spent a lot of time staying over at my sister's place. Around this time, I began to notice that WR and WGF started to behave in a very strange way. As I mentioned, they were always a bit off, but they became even more peculiar. They barely ever seemed interested in interacting with anyone else, only ever talking to each other. WGF was far worse about this than WR. He would give short, monosyllabic answers, but she would just stare blankly at anyone who tried to talk to her, then walk away without saying a word. It was definitely unsettling, but not too bizarre at first. When I stayed over, I would sleep on a futon in FR's office, which was on the ground floor next to the downstairs bathroom. For some odd reason, WGF preferred this bathroom to the one upstairs. She would take long showers in the middle of the night, which didn't bother me too much since I'm a heavy sleeper, and she wasn't loud or anything. I usually slept right through it. But one night, I happened to be awake late, working on homework, and I was still awake when she finished her shower. I was too absorbed in my task to really pay attention to anything else, but I definitely noted hearing the shower shut off because that was my indicator to how late it really was. Approximately 10 minutes later, I look up from my laptop and there she is. Let me begin by saying that I experience lucid dreams when I sleep. What I mean by this is that I can make active decisions within my dreams, and I remember them clearly upon waking. However, I don't always realize that I'm dreaming, especially when the dreams feel incredibly realistic. This is what makes my nightmares all the more terrifying. One nightmare from years ago still haunts me to this day, and just thinking about it makes me cringe. It's hard to recall all the details since it was so long ago, but I still consider it one of my worst. It began in my house. I remember feeling a sense of unease, like that nervous feeling you get before boarding a plane if you're afraid of heights. Then, I heard screams coming from my mom's room and my sister's room. I quickly left my own room to see what was going on. Our house was a 2-story, 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom home, with all the bedrooms upstairs. My room was closest to the stairs. Just as I stepped out of my room, I saw a man I didn't recognize walking out of my mom's room. He looked at me, and I could tell that his face was devoid of any emotion. Before I could focus on anything else about him, the scene around me changed. Suddenly, I was standing on a dimly lit street. The man was barely visible between the streetlights, but when he stepped into the light, I saw that he was holding a scalpel, and his face was splattered with blood. A wave of terror washed over me. For the next 3 hours in the dream, I ran from him, tried to hide, and knocked on the doors of empty houses, hoping for help. But no matter where I went, he always found me. It felt like I was moving in slow motion, unable to escape him. For example, I would crouch behind a bush or duck behind a wall, but he would walk straight to my hiding place, staring at me without fail. Even if I managed to slip away before he got too close, it didn't matter. He would still find me even though he couldn't see me. I could keep running, but that was all I could do. I could never escape him. What made it worse was that, after countless failed attempts, I finally gave up. When he caught up to me, he gave me a cold, motionless smile, grabbed his scalpel, and I can still vividly recall the cold blade dragging across my neck. Surprisingly, I felt a sense of calm, almost peaceful, compared to the panic I'd felt for what seemed like hours. I saw my blood cover my hands as I touched my neck. I closed my eyes, and the next moment, I woke up in a state of panic, drenched in sweat. It hit me then. I had just had a lucid dream where I was killed. I couldn't bring myself to sleep for the rest of the night after that. Since I was a child, it's been a well-known family secret or joke or whatever you want to call it, that there's the ghost of a witch living in my maternal grandmother's upstairs. My older cousin, now in her 30s, says she remembers seeing the witch's ghost as a child. To this day, she's terrified of the stairwell and won't go up for any reason. My slightly older cousin, who's 20 now, has been haunted by stories of seeing the witch for years. However, like me, she was more curious about it. We were both raised with these stories, so we used to climb the stairs together at night with all the lights off, hoping to confront the ghost of the witch. This whole thing started back in the 80s with my grandmother. My grandmother, my mother, and her siblings and my late grandfather moved into a two-story house in the early 80s. The house was still under construction when they bought it. My mom loves to boast that she was the one who picked the house. She was a child at the time, but she thought the unfinished house was beautiful. My grandmother and grandfather took her opinion into account, checked it out, and ended up buying it. My grandmother has always been someone who believes in the paranormal. When she was younger, she dabbled in things like the Ouija board and tarot cards, but never seriously, just light stuff. Her curiosity about these things stemmed from learning about the heritage of the women in our family. Apparently, they were witches who had been executed during the Salem witch trials. In fact, one of the last witch hangings took place just about 5 minutes from my current home. My grandmother's mother was always accused by the family of being a witch. This might have something to do with the fact that she was extremely abusive to my grandmother when she was young. She allegedly poisoned her with rat poison, beat her on her wedding night, emotionally abused her, and so on. It's always been believed that her house was cursed. I only met this woman about 3 times, but there was always something off about her. She could convince you she was the sweetest old lady, all while hiding how abusive she truly was to her daughter and husband. Naturally, when my grandmother discovered that we were descendants of witches, she seriously considered the possibility that her mother might have been one too. My grandmother moved her Ouija board and her tarot cards and her books about ghosts into this new house in the 80s, and only after a year or so did strange things begin to happen. My mother and my grandmother both remember the first occasion of something strange. My grandmother was carrying a laundry basket up the stairs, and suddenly she could no longer continue up. She said it felt as if someone was standing in front of her, forceful as a wall and not allowing her to continue. She physically could not continue up the stairs. She said that the force felt cold and hot at the same time. My mother says she remembers my grandmother trying her hardest to push against it, but not being allowed through. My grandmother calmly said, "All right, let me through," and the forest disappeared. It terrified my mother, and she said it was chilling how calm my grandmother was about it. My grandmother would often have her girlfriends over for tea, as her house is rather large with 2 living rooms and decorative old-fashioned charm. It's similar to a small mansion, and she has quite a collection of tea and antique pots and cups. One tea party in the afternoon, though, would be the first visual sighting of the ghost of the witch. She was having tea with a few of her friends, old ladies, when one of the ladies looked up and over my grandmother's shoulder. She smiled at something behind her, then returned her eyes to my grandmother and asked, "Who's your other guest? I've never met her before." My grandmother thought someone else had showed, but she'd not invited anyone else. She turned around and saw that nothing was there. Her friends then began convincing my grandmother that they weren't crazy. They'd all seen her and described her as an old lady with long wavy gray hair that's messy and a dirty dress, and with the saddest, most confused-looking expression on her face. Though she found it quite interesting and she did believe her friends, she remained still calm about this experience. Those girlfriends of hers suddenly no longer wanted to come over to her house anymore. My grandfather passed away, and several years later, my grandmother remarried. Neither of them ever experienced anything or felt anything off about the house. None of the men who ever entered the house felt or saw anything at all. Some of the men are skeptics and some are believers, but regardless, none of them ever saw anything. It seemed the ghost of the witch would only present herself to the women of the family or women visitors. Given her heritage, it would make sense. My grandmother, who is still haunted by this ghost, which has never had an explanation as to why everyone began regarding her as the witch. She simply says that she felt the lady was a witch. My oldest cousin, the one who is now 30, was the second one to visually see this ghostly lady. She was a teenager at the time she saw it, about to be 20. She was alone in the house on Christmas night while everyone sat outside in the large garage. The family often sat out there when they smoked and spent hours there. My cousin claimed that she was going up the stairs to use the bathroom, too embarrassed to use the one on the first floor. She didn't feel like turning the light on, so she just carefully walked up, guided by the light of the downstairs Christmas tree. It was then that she said she saw an old woman with a sorrowful expression and long wavy gray hair walk slowly past her at the top of the stairs. She walked away into the computer room, which was once my mother's bedroom. It's currently and was when my cousin had her experience a room full of mirrors and antiques and my great-grandmother's belongings. My cousin said that the old lady walked to that room and she refused to climb the stairs and investigate. She ran out of the house crying to her father that there was a ghost. He didn't believe her and laughed it off. She was plagued with nightmares for the longest time and currently refuses to go anywhere near the stairwell. After these occasions with the witch, she'd become a household name, and my older cousin and I were raised on the spooky tales. This was one of the many things that had embedded a fascination with the paranormal and morbid into my mind from a young age. My grandmother would tell only the young ladies of the house these stories, as the men thought she was crazy regardless of the beliefs on the paranormal, simply because they'd never seen anything in the house. My grandmother told my older cousin and I the story of the night that one of her taxidermied birds came back to life for a few minutes. My grandmother and her new husband were both avid hunters and went duck hunting often, as well as fishing in ponds at nighttime. They had their best catch stuffed by a taxidermist and placed in a glass box. The stuffed birds sat atop on a cabinet in the computer room, the one the witch apparently walked to. She said that she and her husband were asleep one night when they were startled awake by a loud sound. The sound was of hundreds of birds chirping and screeching and flying. They thought that some birds had attacked their attic and gotten stuck inside, so that was the first place she checked. Nothing was inside though, not a single bird. The sound continued though, and it seemed to be coming from no specific place. She couldn't locate the sound. She went to open the computer room's door, and when she did, deafening silence fell over the house and not a single chirp was heard. She found the taxidermy bird on the floor. The glass box busted into tiny crystals on the floor. This story in the infamous witch story led my curious cousin and I to venture into the computer room as many times as we could. My oldest cousin called us crazy, but we called us brave and curious. We only liked to go up at night because it created a better ambience, and we felt we had a better chance of seeing something terrifying for ourselves. We played with antique mirrors, dug through old wooden trunks in search of my grandmother's Ouija board, and did ghost chants and witch spells that we found online. When that got boring and came with no results, we got on Microsoft Word. I'm talking old school with Clippy, the paperclip dude, and wrote murder mystery stories. We'd write the most gore-filled story we could imagine, then print it out on my grandmother's printer and hide several copies of it around the house to creep people out. Sometimes the very old desktop computer would take control of itself and start searching for things on its own. We witnessed it type in a series of confusing codes and numbers, then pull up various pictures of headstones and scroll quickly through them. We didn't scream and run out, as our oldest cousin would have. We simply watched in silence. The computer abruptly shut off, and our only fear was that we'd get in trouble for breaking our grandmother's computer. The lights would turn on and off in the room, not as if flickering, though. They turned off and on dutifully, as if someone was doing it on purpose. Strange sounds came from the floor, like scratching and bumping, and the mirror always seemed to be in a different spot every time we turned around to look at it. Books fell off shelves, and the other newer computer kept on the other side of the room would fire up by itself. Before my older cousin and I ever really delved into the witch story, she grew up. She was only a few years older than me, but her interest turned to boys and being popular in school. She had her first slide phone and stopped paying me any attention at all. We'd once been close, but her own social standards forced us apart, and she rarely spoke to me. She was rarely mean to me, but she acknowledged me only on holidays. She evolved into a preppy popular girl, while I spiraled into a paranormal-obsessed young teenager who scoured the internet for gore and supernatural, and I still ventured on my own into the computer room upstairs. My fascination for the paranormal was deeper than that of my cousins. Hers had just been a phase. Mine had been my entire life. Both sides of my family believe in ghosts and each have stories of their own experiences. The only skeptic, surprisingly, is my mother. She does admit, though, that she only doesn't believe because she tries not to, because she's scared to. My father, on the other hand, was my biggest supplier of creepy stories, and he always told me, if you go looking for something, you'll find it sooner or later. Because he knew how badly I wanted to explore ghosts, so I never stopped looking at my grandmother's house. My great-grandmother, nearly 102 years old at that time, was placed into a nursing home. Because her house couldn't be afforded and all the money was going to the nursing home and the house to the state, There was an occasion where the family was invited to go collect some things from our house, anything that we liked because they were going to get thrown away anyway. I went and took some creepy old dolls from the 20s, and my mother took some sentimental items. When I was in my great-grandmother's bedroom alone, staring into the large Victorian mirror of hers, chills rushed through me, and I left when I saw a shadow dart behind me. I turned around and searched for what had made the shadow, but the strong smell of garlic and burning wood dizzied me and forced me to leave the room. The presence felt sad and angry at the same time. My aunt, who had more business knowledge than any of us at the time, was helping my grandmother close the probate on the house. It was her job to keep the house in good condition, so she had to visit it alone frequently. On the last day of having to go inside, she went to take the one item that she had wanted from the estate, a vintage lamp that reminded her of her 70s childhood. She took the lamp and bid the house a relieved farewell. She locked the house up behind her, and suddenly a massive bolt of lightning struck the yard just in front of her. The rain began to pour and the wind began to howl. Blackened clouds, bruising the sky above her and making a great rage of storm. She quickly tried to unlock the house, but the keys seemed to not even fit in the doorknob anymore, even though she just used it. The door opened on its own after she pulled the key away from it. She ran inside to shelter from the rain and sat the lamp down. She claims she saw something run through the kitchen from the corner of her eye, and with the witch rumors about her wicked grandmother, decided to leave the lamp. She closed the door behind her, leaving the lamp. When she stepped out onto the front porch, the rain had stopped and there wasn't even a breeze. The sky cleared and there wasn't a cloud in the sky. She still claims to this day that her grandmother's house was cursed. A few years later, my great-grandmother died. I attended the funeral and my family makes jokes the whole time. My grandmother was hardly sad that this day had come, as she had had to take care of the wicked woman who abused her. She took care of her every need every day from her 70th birthday until her death at 102. She was relieved, and when the funeral home workers apologized and gave condolences, we all looked at one another. My aunt, stepping out of the restroom while the big ivory casket was being rolled into the chapel, accidentally whacked it with the door and nearly knocked it over, nearly killing all of us as we struggled not to bust into laughter. It was the most humorous funeral I'd ever attended in my life. After her death, my grandmother was plagued with nightmares of her mother coming back to haunt her or being trapped with her in the afterlife. One night, she found her husband walking around the house with a shotgun in his hand. She asked him what he was doing and he looked terrified. This was the first occasion when a man in the house had experienced something paranormal inside it. He was shaking and he shouted to my grandmother that your mother is here. She begged him what he was talking about and he explained, I smell her. I feel her. Your mother is here. Don't you smell that? My mother had always worn the same perfume, Elizabeth Taylor's White Diamonds. It was the only perfume she'd ever worn, and she spritzed it on herself heavily every day, sometimes twice a day. It was a scent that had sickened my grandmother's husband for the whole time he'd known the old lady. My grandmother recently tried to give us some of her mother's old jewelry because she wanted it out of her house so badly. She claimed it was cursed. I believed her. My aunt certainly believed her, and my older cousin, though so long separated from our experiences as children, refused to take the jewelry. I thought of taking it, but I already own a piece of jewelry that was passed down through the women of our family through all the witches. It's a sapphire ring that saw several generations, and for a reason I find more than coincidental end up with me. After my great-grandmother gave it to my grandmother, she gave it to my mother before I was born and said, "Give this to her." My mother didn't even know she was having me a girl yet. She asked her mother how she could assume I was a girl, and my grandmother simply replied, "Just give this to her." And well, here I am, a very paranormal inclined girl wearing the witchy sapphire ring today. I haven't seen my oldest cousin in years. The last time was at a funeral. She's become a drug addict and moved far away. My other cousin got married, moved away, and doesn't seem to give the paranormal a second thought anymore. It's like her memories of the witch and the computer room have been completely erased. Whenever the topic comes up, she acts like a different person. My grandmother's friends no longer visit, and whether they admit it or not, I believe it's because of the ghostly witch. My mother thinks my grandmother and I are crazy, but it feels like we're just more sensitive to these kinds of things. Recently, my grandmother told me a strange story. She was in a store when a short, polite old woman approached her. The woman was dressed in an all-white robe and looked shockingly pale. She had a calming, friendly presence and asked my grandmother for directions to the exit, saying she couldn't find it. Just as my grandmother was about to tell her, the glowing woman vanished into thin air. No one believes her except for me. I have my own Ouija board, tarot cards, crystals, mirrors, antique objects, antique dolls, dowsing rods, EMF meters, and EVP readers. For about 3 years, I obsessively tried to contact a specific ghost, and I wouldn't be surprised if I've opened doors to something else in the process, considering the lengths I've gone to. I still try to reach out to this particular ghost, and for now, he only contacts me in my dreams. But if you search long enough, you're bound to find something.